Hey there and welcome back. If you are getting comfortable right now, maybe pulling the covers a little higher, letting your shoulders drop away from your ears, letting your jaw unclench, letting whatever you were carrying through the day begin to settle quietly into the pillow. Good. Because tonight is one of those stories that asks you to slow down, to step into a world where time moved at a different pace, where evenings stretched until 4 in the morning, and mornings did not really begin until past noon, and where every gesture, every dance, every glance across a crowded room could change the entire course of a young woman's life. Tonight, you are invited. A card has arrived. It is heavy, cream-coloured, the edges gilded so faintly you have to turn it toward the candlelight to see them, the handwriting copperplate and immaculate. Your name is written across the front in the kind of script that someone has clearly taken their time over. Beneath your name, an address in Mayfair. Beneath that, a date in May. You are coming out. You are entering for the first time what the people of Regency, England simply called the season. And for the next 4 months or so, your life is going to look like nothing it has ever looked like before. So let us take this slowly. Let us walk together through what it actually meant in the year 1814 to be a young woman of marriageable age in a beautiful gown you did not entirely choose, walking down a London staircase toward a future that had been planned by other people for almost as long as you had been alive. The year is 1814. Napoleon has just abdicated for the first time in the spring of that year, and is on his way to a small island in the Mediterranean, which it is widely assumed will be his final residence. The long war that has shaped your entire childhood, that took your eldest brother into the army at 17, and your second cousin into the navy at 14, that made the price of bread go up, and the price of muslin go up, and the price of almost everything go up, has for the moment paused. The men who have spent years away on the peninsula or in the Mediterranean are coming home. The mood in London this spring is, by every contemporary account, almost giddy. There has not been a season like this in years. The peace will turn out to be premature. Napoleon will return from Elba within 12 months. And the whole thing will end definitively only at Waterloo in June of the following year. But you do not know that yet. What you know is that London this spring is going to be brilliant, full, expensive, and, if your mother is right about your prospects, possibly the most consequential few months of your life so far. The Prince Regent presides over all of this. That is George, the eldest son of King George III, the king who has been declared unfit to rule because of the recurring illness that has gradually overtaken his mind. The regent has been ruling in his father's name since 1811, and his court is, by reputation, the most extravagant the capital has seen in a generation. He is a man of enormous appetites, considerable taste, and very little discipline. The pavilion at Brighton, that strange and beautiful palace with its onion domes and its endless connected rooms, is being built and rebuilt according to his vision. He is, in his way, the spirit of the era that will eventually bear his name. And whether or not you ever meet him personally, and at the highest levels of society you might, briefly, in passing, his presence shapes everything about the world you are about to enter. For your family, the practical question is, what is a season, and how does ours work? Let me give you the structure, because I think it helps to have the shape of the thing in mind before we go any further. The London season was, in essence, the social manifestation of the parliamentary calendar. Parliament sat from roughly January or February through July or August. During those months, the great families of England, who otherwise lived on their country estates, came down to town to attend the sessions, to conduct their business, to consult with their lawyers and bankers, and to participate in an elaborate, carefully orchestrated calendar of social events that had been growing more refined and more demanding for the better part of 100 years. The season was not originally designed as a marriage market for young women. It evolved into one. By the time you were receiving your card in the spring of 1814, the marriage mart aspect of the season has become so dominant that everything else, the politics, the business, the catching up with relatives one only sees in town, has come to feel like the surrounding context for the central question: who is coming out this year? And who will they marry? Coming out, for a young woman of your station, was a single specific event followed by a long and complicated process. The single event was your formal presentation, either at court, if your family had the connections to manage it, or simply at your first major ball of the season. From that night onward, you were what was called out. You could be addressed by gentlemen who had not been formally introduced to you in the schoolroom phase of your life. You could be invited to balls and roots and breakfasts, and Venetian breakfasts and morning concerts. You could appear at Almack's, that famously exclusive set of assembly rooms in King Street, if you had been judged suitable by the women who controlled access to it. You could, in short, be courted. Before that night you had been a girl in the schoolroom, off limits to suitors, your existence acknowledged but not really considered as a social fact. After it, you were a candidate. That word, candidate, is one I want to come back to, because as much as the Regency world dressed all of this up in language about romance and accomplishment and the natural unfolding of a young woman's social life, the thing that was actually being conducted, at its core, was a candidacy. You were being put forward for consideration. The consideration would be made by men and by their families, and by the network of mothers and aunts and married sisters who functioned as the actual market analysts of the entire system. The result of this consideration, ideally, would be an offer of marriage. The offer, if accepted, would result in a settlement. The settlement would secure your future, and the future it secured would determine almost every material fact of the rest of your life. The clothes you would wear, the house you would live in, the number of servants you would have to manage, the kind of education your children would receive, the amount of money you would have if you were widowed, whether your old age would be comfortable or precarious. This is not how anyone said it out loud, of course. People did not, at balls, refer to the marriage market in the language of finance, though they thought about it in those terms constantly. The language of the season was the language of dancing partners and pretty dresses and pleasant young men of good family. The language behind that language, the language spoken in fathers' libraries and in the correspondence between matrons of opposing households, was considerably more direct. The Regency was not a sentimental era about money. It was an era that understood with great clarity that the difference between a life of gentle dignity and a life of slow humiliation, for a woman of your class, very often came down to which gentleman handed you down to supper at a particular ball in a particular spring. The question of who was invited to the season at all is more complicated than the romance novels tend to suggest. At the very top you have the great aristocratic families, the dukes and the marquises and the earls and the viscounts and the barons, and their daughters move through the season with a kind of natural inevitability. The doors of every drawing room in town open for them. The patronesses of Almack sign their vouchers without hesitation. The dance cards fill themselves before the orchestra has finished tuning. Below them you have the wealthy gentry, families with substantial estates but no title, and these families participate fully in the season, but with rather more management required. Their daughters need sponsoring by a relative, who has herself been presented at court. Their vouchers for Almack's must be requested and might be refused. Their dance cards do not fill themselves. They are filled by careful introduction, by the cultivation of useful connections, by the attentive labour of mothers who know exactly which young man's grandmother went to school with which patroness's aunt. Below this, you have the lesser gentry, the country families with modest estates and limited London connections. For their daughters, the full London season may simply not be possible. Instead, they have the season of the local market town, the assembly rooms at Bath or Tunbridge Wells or Cheltenham, the country balls hosted by the squire's wife, the chance meetings at the houses of neighbours. This is the world Jane Austen wrote about, mostly. Her characters are not, for the most part, debutantes at Almack's. They are young women navigating a world where the season is something glimpsed at one remove, where a visit to London is a major event, where the local assembly is the social calendar's brightest moment. For tonight, though, I want to take you into the version of the season that has been most thoroughly documented and most vividly remembered. The London version, the Mayfair version, the version with the white gowns and the ostrich plumes and the Wednesday nights at Almack's and the carriage rides in Hyde Park at 5 in the afternoon. Because if you can understand that version in its full strangeness and its full beauty and its full exhausting complication, you can understand the others by extension. The country assembly was a smaller, simpler, slightly improvised version of what the London season had perfected. So your card has arrived, or rather, the family decision has been made, and the preparations are beginning. Your mother has written to your aunt in town, who has written to her cousin who is presented at court, who has written to her friend who is on the lists for Almack's. The dressmaker has been booked, the townhouse has been opened, if your family owns one, or rented for the season, if not. The carriage is being made ready. The trunks are being packed. The whole apparatus of moving an upper-class English family from country to capital, an apparatus that has been refined over 100 years of practice, is rolling into motion, and at the centre of it, slightly bewildered, slightly excited, somewhat terrified, is you. I want you to hold that picture in your mind for a moment. The card on the silver tray, the mother making lists, the dressmaker's measurements being taken in the morning room, the first faint sense that something enormous is about to happen, and that you are, somehow, both the centre of it and the least powerful person in the entire arrangement. Because that, more than anything else, is the situation a Regency debutante found herself in at the beginning of her first season. The honoured guest at her own performance, with very little say in how the performance was staged. So that is the world we are walking into. And before we get to London, before the carriage even rolls down the drive, I want to spend some time in the country with the family that produced you, because the months of preparation that came before your departure tell us almost as much as the season itself does about what kind of young woman you were being asked to become. Before the carriage leaves the drive, before the trunks are packed, before any card arrives at all, your season has already been in preparation for years. Most likely, it has been in preparation since you were about 11 or 12. That is when, in a household like yours, the schoolroom education of a daughter shifts from being a general matter of getting her literate and numerate and becomes a much more specific project. The project of producing a young woman who can be presented in society without embarrassment, courted without obvious flaw, married without disaster. The person managing this project is, almost always, your mother. And I want to spend a moment with her, because I think the figure of the Regency mother gets less attention than she deserves in popular accounts of this era. The novels and the films tend to focus on the daughter, who is the romantic protagonist, and on the father, who provides the comic relief or the financial threat. The mother often gets reduced to a flutter of anxiety about marriage prospects, a sort of comic background figure with a permanently fluttering handkerchief. But in real life, the mother of a Regency debutante was the operations manager of an enormously complex, multi-year, high-stakes undertaking. She was, in effect, both the strategist and the executor of her family's most important social investment, and she was almost entirely without formal training or institutional support. She had to figure all of it out. She had to think about the long arc. If she had 3 daughters, she had to think about how to space their entries into society so that they were not competing too directly with one another, while also not waiting so long that the elder ones grew uncomfortably old before the younger ones came out. There was an unspoken convention that younger sisters did not come out before elder ones, and a family with 3 or 4 daughters in close succession could find itself in a kind of slow-motion logistical bind, the elder still searching for a husband while the younger waited in the schoolroom, growing impatient. Mothers managed this with the kind of attention that, in another era, might have run a small business. They thought about which season suited which daughter best. They thought about whether to combine 2 girls' first years if the elder had not married in her debut season. They thought about the optics of every decision, because the world was watching, and the world remembered. She had to think about the family's finances and what could be afforded. A full London season for a debutante, if you did it properly with the wardrobe and the carriage and the rented house in a fashionable street, and the supper parties given in your own drawing room, could cost the modern equivalent of many tens of thousands of pounds. Some families did it once, magnificently, and then could not afford to repeat it. Others spread the cost across multiple years and accepted a more modest establishment, a less fashionable street, fewer of the very expensive items in the wardrobe, more reliance on the kindness of relatives. A few of the very wealthiest could simply absorb the expense without strain, but those families were a small minority. Most middle gentry families, the kind who appear in Austen's novels, considered the London season a substantial financial undertaking that required real planning. She had to think about your accomplishments, that very specific Regency word for the cluster of skills that a young lady was expected to be able to display in company. You were expected to be able to play the pianoforte, or the harp, or both. You were expected to draw, in pencil and in watercolour. You were expected to speak French passably, and Italian if you could manage it, and to read both. You were expected to embroider, to do fine needlework, to know how to fold linens and how to instruct servants in the management of a household. You were expected to dance, and to dance well every fashionable dance currently in circulation. You were expected to sing with restraint, in a voice that carried only as far as the room required. You were expected to read but lightly, and to know enough about literature and poetry to make pleasant conversation about them. You were not expected to be learned. Open displays of learning, especially in front of gentlemen, were considered unbecoming. You were expected to be, in the precise word of the era, accomplished. Not educated, accomplished. The governess was the day-to-day manager of all of this, a respectable young or middle-aged woman, often herself the daughter of a clergyman or a minor gentleman, herself often without prospects of marriage, herself working for wages that were not generous. The governess shaped the daily rhythm of the schoolroom and was responsible, in effect, for the bulk of your education. Some governesses were brilliant, energetic, intellectually curious women who genuinely loved their work and made of it something noble. Others were tired, resigned, and dutiful. The position was by reputation one of the loneliest in English life. Neither servant nor family, not quite a friend to her pupils, never quite at ease in any of the rooms she occupied. The governess was in many ways the silent witness to what the gentry were really like behind the doors of their drawing rooms. She saw you grow up, and then, when you were grown, she packed her box and went on to another family. In your last year before coming out, the schoolroom phase begins to shade into the more direct preparation for the season. You spend more time on your dancing. A dancing master is engaged to come down from London or up from the nearest large town to drill you in the quadrille and the country dance, and increasingly the waltz. That scandalously continental innovation which has just begun to be tolerated in the more advanced sets, and which your mother is not entirely certain you should learn at all, but which she suspects you will need to know. You spend more time on deportment. A backboard is brought out, and you wear it for hours at a stretch. A flat board strapped across your shoulders to keep your back perfectly straight. You walk with books on your head. You practice your curtsy, low and slow, with absolutely no wobble in your knees until you can do it in your sleep. Your voice is corrected. Your laugh is corrected. The manner of holding your fan is corrected. The manner of holding your gloves is corrected. Every gesture you make is in some small way taught. And meanwhile, in the rooms where you are not, your mother and your father are having the long conversations that fix the framework of your season. How much will they spend? Whose townhouse will they use, or will they rent? And where? Which relatives will they call upon for introductions? Has your aunt, the one who is presented at court, agreed to sponsor you for your own presentation? Has the dressmaker been engaged? Will you go to Bath first to be fitted, or wait until you reach London? Which young men of your acquaintance, sons of neighbours, sons of your father's school friends, sons of the families with whom yours has the longest standing connections, are going to be in town this season? Are any of them going to be there in a way that suggests their families are also looking? These conversations have been happening in fragments for years, but in the months before your first season, they intensify. There is a sense in the country house of preparation reaching its final phase. The maids are folding tissue paper into trunks. The undermaids are darning your stockings and pressing your shifts. The cook is making sure the housekeeper has the recipes for the smaller dishes you will need to serve at supper parties. The footman who is to accompany you to town is being measured for new livery. The horses that will pull the carriage are being chosen. Everything that will accompany you on the journey, from your gloves to your prayer book, is being checked, repaired, replaced, inventoried. I want to pause on something here, because I think it is worth seeing clearly. The level of organisation involved in a Regency season has very few exact parallels in modern life. The closest, perhaps, is something like a wedding, or a major theatrical production. Many specialised workers, considerable capital, months of preparation, all converging on a relatively short period of intense activity, all centred on a person who is herself, in many ways, the object rather than the agent of the production. You did not plan your season. Your season was planned for you. You wore the gown that had been chosen. You danced with the partners to whom you had been introduced. You went to the houses on whose lists your family had been placed. You smiled. You curtsied. You replied with the words you had been trained to use. The amount of personal autonomy involved was, by the standards of any modern expectation, very small. And yet, within that small space, An enormous amount of meaning was made or lost. The journey from country to town was itself a substantial undertaking. If you lived in the north, you might be travelling for 3 or 4 days. If you lived in the home counties, perhaps a single very long day. The carriage, loaded with trunks and hat boxes, would set out early, with you and your mother, and perhaps a maid inside, your father and your brothers travelling separately on horseback or in a second carriage, and the journey would proceed at the pace the roads allowed. You would stop at coaching inns for changes of horses and for meals. You would sleep at posting houses where the proprietor remembered your father from the year before. You would gradually watch the landscape change from the agricultural quiet of the country into the increasing density of villages and market towns, and then, finally, into the long approach to London itself, with its outlying suburbs giving way to the terraces and squares of the capital. The first sight of London, for a young woman who had perhaps never seen it before, was almost universally reported in contemporary letters and diaries as overwhelming, the smoke hanging in a permanent grey haze over the rooftops, the noise more than you had imagined possible, even from the carriage with its windows up, the press of people, the rattle of other carriages, the cries of street vendors in dialects you could not always follow, the smell of coal fires and horses and 1,000 kitchens. Even for a girl who had spent every summer at Bath, London was something else. It was not just larger, it was different in kind. And as the carriage turned at last into the quiet residential streets of Mayfair, into the calm of a square with its iron railings and its plane trees and its terraced fronts of pale brick and white stucco, into the sudden gentility that distinguished the West End from the rest of the metropolis, you would feel, for the first time, the actual weight of where you had arrived. Your house for the season was waiting. The knocker was on the door. The shutters were open. The first servants had gone ahead of you and were standing in the hall to welcome the family. And in some upstairs room in tissue paper, your gowns were already hanging. The season technically had not begun, but it was in every meaningful sense about to. The London house your family has taken for the season is in one of the squares or streets of Mayfair, and where exactly it sits has already told the world a great deal about you before you have so much as set foot in a drawing room. London in 1814 is, in its fashionable West End, a city of geographical hierarchy. Berkeley Square, Grosvenor Square, Hanover Square, the streets running off them, Brook Street, Mount Street, Curzon Street, Park Lane. These addresses carry weight. They communicate, instantly, the rank of the family inside. Across the road in a different street, whose name does not appear in the same sentences in the morning newspapers, a similar terraced house with similar pale brick and similar iron railings would be in pure architectural terms almost identical, but its address would be slightly less. And in a season where everything was being read for signal, the address mattered. If your family owned a townhouse, you were fortunate. Most did not, even among the gentry who came up for the season. The expense of maintaining a substantial London property year-round, with its housekeeper and its caretaker, and its fires lit periodically through the winter to keep the damp out, was beyond what most families could justify when they used the house only during the 4 or 5 months of the season. So most rented. The rental market for the season was a brisk and specialised one. Agents handled it. Letters went back and forth in the months before, between your father's man of business and the agents who handled the leases on the most desirable streets. The terms were negotiated. The dates were fixed. By March you knew where you were going. By April the housekeeper had been sent ahead with the senior staff to open the rooms, beat the carpets, light the fires, arrange the linen, and ensure that everything was in readiness for the family's arrival. The opening of a London house for the season was its own small ritual. The shutters, which had been closed for months, were thrown back. The dust covers were lifted from the furniture and folded away. The chimneys were swept. The kitchen ranges were lit. The plate, which had been kept in the strong room over the winter, was brought out and polished. The bedchambers were aired. The water closets, by 1814 a regular feature of fashionable London houses, though still a relatively recent convenience, were checked. The cellars were stocked, the whole apparatus of a substantial gentry establishment, an apparatus that involved between perhaps 8 and 20 servants depending on the size of the family and the scale of their entertainments, was being rolled into operation. Inside, the house had a logic you would come to learn. The ground floor contained the entrance hall, the dining room, and usually the morning room, which is where the family took breakfast and where, when there were no callers, your mother might sit to write her letters and manage the household. The first floor, the floor you climbed up to by the principal staircase, contained the drawing rooms, the great rooms of the house, where the family received visitors and where on the most important evenings they might give a small dance or a substantial dinner. The drawing rooms ran in suite, often 2 or 3 connected rooms with folding doors between, so that on a major occasion the doors could be thrown open and the whole space made into one. The second floor contained the principal bedchambers. The third floor, the nursery floor in a household with younger children, or the bedchambers for unmarried daughters and visiting relatives. The fourth floor and the attics, the servants' rooms, the basement, the kitchen, the scullery, the housekeeper's room, the butler's pantry, the wine cellar, the coal hole, a whole building organised, as Regency townhouses were organised everywhere in Mayfair, into a vertical map of class, with the family in the middle and the staff above and below them. Your room is on the second floor, or perhaps the third if your mother has decided that the second floor bedchambers should be reserved for entertaining bedrooms, the small private sitting rooms attached to the principal chambers, where she might receive a particularly close friend on a confidential matter. Your room, wherever it is, has been arranged for you. The bed is made up with fresh linen. There is a small writing table by the window, a washstand with a porcelain basin and ewer, a wardrobe and a chest of drawers, a long pier glass, the full-length mirror in which you will, over the next 4 months, look at yourself dressed in more different costumes than you have worn in your entire life so far. A maid has been assigned to you. She will help you dress in the morning, dress for dinner in the evening, dress for the ball after dinner. She will arrange your hair, look after your gloves, brush out your gowns. You may have known her for years. She may be the upper housemaid from the country house, brought up to town for the season, because she knows your hair and your habits. Or she may be a London maid hired for the duration. Either way, you will spend more time in her company over the next few weeks than with almost anyone else in the family except your mother. The first proper morning in London is, in the established pattern, devoted to settling. You unpack. The trunks, which have been delivered from the carriage and brought up the back stairs, are opened. Your maid begins the long, careful work of laying out gowns in the wardrobe, hanging them with cedar shavings to keep moths from the muslin. Your books are placed on the small bookshelf. Your writing case is set out on the table. Your prayer book and your Bible are placed on the bedside cabinet. The smaller items, the gloves and stockings and reticules, the shawls, the fans, the slippers, are arranged in drawers. By the end of the morning, the room has begun to look as though you live in it. By the end of the afternoon, after a rest, perhaps, or a walk in the small garden if the house has one, you might be ready to think about going out. But you do not, on this first day, go out into society. The first day is for arrival. The first day is for the family to recover from the journey, for your mother to receive any urgent correspondence that has been waiting, for your father to go to his club and let it be known that the family is now in town. The first round of social activity, calling cards left at the houses of your principal connections, will begin tomorrow. The first proper evening engagements, dinners and small parties, will begin within the week. The first ball, the first major event at which you will be presented as a debutante, will follow shortly after that, depending on what is on the calendar and what your sponsor advises. In the meantime, on this first morning of your London life, your mother takes you to the dressmaker. The Regency dressmaker, or modiste, was an important enough figure in the lives of fashionable women that her name and her address were known and discussed in the way that any high-end specialist is discussed today by clients who depend on her. The most fashionable London modistes of the period had clients who travelled across the country to be fitted by them. Some of them were French, or claimed to be French taste being the gold standard of fashion in this period despite, or perhaps because of, the long war that had cut England off from Paris for so much of the previous 20 years. The most celebrated names of the era ran establishments that were, in effect, small businesses with a workroom of seamstresses, an apprentice or two, a front shop where clients were received, and a fitting room where the actual measurement and fitting took place. You arrived at the dressmaker's with your mother, and were received with the particular courtesy reserved for new clients of significant prospects. You were seated. You were offered perhaps a small refreshment. The principal modiste herself, the woman whose name appeared on the door, would emerge from the back to meet you, and would, with practiced expertise, look you over from head to foot in a way that managed to be both thorough and polite. She would ask about colouring, about preference, about the events for which gowns were required. She would consult with your mother about budget, about quantity, about timing. She would propose. She would describe in the particular, slightly exotic vocabulary of high fashion the effects she could produce, the fabrics, the ornament, the cuts. She would, if she were a good modiste, manage your mother and you with an attentive precision that made each of you feel that your individual taste was being honoured, even as the broader contours of the season's wardrobe were being efficiently sketched out. The wardrobe of a debutante in 1814 was an enormous undertaking in itself. You needed, as a baseline, a presentation gown for court if you were being presented there. An item of clothing whose specifications I will return to in a moment because they are extraordinary. You needed at least 3 or 4 ball gowns, since the same gown could not be worn at successive balls without comment, and a season might involve dozens of major balls. You needed evening gowns for dinner parties, which were less elaborate than ball gowns but still substantial. You needed morning dresses, the lighter gowns worn for receiving callers and going out shopping. You needed walking dresses, slightly more substantial gowns for promenading in the park. You needed riding habits, those tailored masculine cut suits with their long skirts for the morning rides in the park. You needed pelisses, the long-fitted coats worn over walking dresses in cool weather. You needed spencers, the short-fitted jackets worn in milder weather. You needed shawls for the chillier evenings. You needed gloves, dozens of pairs, since gloves got dirty quickly and white gloves had to be perfectly clean. You needed slippers, dozens of pairs, since dance slippers wore through after a few balls and could not be repaired economically. You needed bonnets, hats, caps, fichus, chemisettes, reticules. You needed everything, and almost all of it, in the late spring and summer of a London season, was being made for you, item by item, by the workrooms of the modistes. You were now being driven between, the fittings stretched across days, and then weeks. You stood in the chemise and stays you would wear under each gown, on a small platform in the fitting room, while a seamstress on her knees pinned the hem and another stood behind to adjust the back, and the modist walked around you, considering the line of the bodice and the fall of the skirt. You stood for hours. You were tired. Your back ached. You were not allowed to fidget. The modiste consulted with your mother. The seamstresses worked in silence except when spoken to. The afternoon light fell through the muslin at the window, illuminating the gauze and the silk, and the satin, and the fine wool, the materials that would shortly become the actual physical envelope of your social existence over the coming months. Most of your gowns, by the convention of the era, were white. The white gown for an unmarried young woman, particularly in her first season, was so universal that it has come down to us as one of the defining visual features of the Regency debutante. It signalled youth, it signalled purity, in the sense the era used that word, meaning unmarried and respectable. It signalled the absence of the more elaborate colouring permitted to married women and to those who had been out for several seasons, and who could now wear the deeper colours, the rich blues and the warm reds, that gave the older women's clothes their distinct presence in the ballroom. White was the colour of the candidate. The white muslin, in particular, was associated with the young, and the white silks and satins for evening, and the white sprigged muslins worn during the day. There were exceptions. A pale blue, a soft pink, a delicate green were within the acceptable range, but the dominant note of a debutante's wardrobe was the white that in the lit ballrooms of London made the young women look almost like a separate species among the more colourful and confident married women in their stronger shades. The materials themselves were among the finest the world produced. The muslin came from India, the very lightest and finest of it, the fabric so delicate that it was said in jest, though never seriously, that you could pass an entire gown's worth of it through a wedding ring. The silks came from Lyon, from Italy, from China. The lace came from Brussels, from Honiton, from Buckinghamshire. The fine wools came from the West Country and from Yorkshire. The ribbons, the embroidery threads, the trimmings came from a network of specialist suppliers across England and the continent that had survived the war years through ingenuity and smuggling. Standing in your modist's fitting room in the spring of 1814, you were standing at the centre of an international supply chain that touched 5 continents, and the gowns that were being constructed around you were, in their materials alone, among the most expensive ordinary objects that existed in the world at that moment. Underneath the gowns, of course, you wore the underclothes that gave the Regency silhouette its distinctive line. The chemise, a long, simple linen shift that went next to the skin, was the foundation. Over it went the stays, which had changed considerably from the heavily structured garments of the previous century. The Regency stays were lighter, shorter, less constricting, designed to lift the bust and provide a smooth line under the high-waisted gowns of the era, rather than to crush the body into a particular shape. Some women, particularly those of slight build, wore short stays that ended at the bottom of the bust, providing only the minimum support. Others wore longer stays that extended to the hip. Either way, the effect was very different from the constrictions worn by their grandmothers, and considerably more comfortable, though still tighter than most modern women's clothing. Over the stays went the petticoat, the simple white underskirt that gave the gown its body. Over that, the gown itself, with its high waistline just under the bust, its straight or slightly flared skirt falling to the ankle, its short sleeves for evening or longer sleeves for day, its low or high neckline depending on occasion. The whole effect in muslin was light, graceful, classical. The era's love of all things Greek and Roman, partly inherited from the 18th century's neoclassical revival and partly intensified by the Napoleonic conquests that had brought antiquities flooding back into European awareness, was visible in every line of the costume. You looked, in the right light, in the right gown, like a figure that had stepped down from a frieze. That was, in fact, the intended effect. There is a small and persistent legend about Regency women dampening their muslin gowns to make them cling more closely to the body. It is mentioned in a few satirical pieces from the era, and it has been repeated countless times since. There is very little evidence that the practice was ever widespread among women of any respectability. It would have been considered indecent. It would have been physically uncomfortable in cool English weather. It was almost certainly an exaggeration meant to caricature the more revealing fashions of the period, rather than a description of actual behavior. But the fact that the joke existed, the satirists could make it, and audiences could understand it, tells you something about the cultural anxiety that the new, lighter, more revealing styles of the Regency had produced. The clothing of 1814 was, by the standards of 1780, almost shockingly informal. The body was visible in a way that earlier dress had concealed. Older observers complained. Younger observers celebrated. The muslin, dampened or not, was the focus of a generational argument about what young women's bodies should look like in public. Your hair, in 1814, was being arranged according to the prevailing fashion, which was a softer, more natural style than the elaborate constructions of the previous generation. Curls clustered around the face. The longer hair behind was caught up into a low knot or chignon, sometimes ornamented with a comb, a bandeau, a ribbon, or for the most formal evenings with feathers or with the ostrich plumes that were required for a court presentation. You did not, in 1814, wear powder. The white powdered hairstyles of the 18th century were, by this point, associated almost entirely with the older generation, with court formality, and with French aristocrats who had not survived the Revolution. Powder for the Regency young was the past. Your own natural colour, dressed simply, was the present. Your gloves, at all times when you were out, were essential. Long white evening gloves for the ball, reaching above the elbow, made of the finest kid leather. Shorter gloves for daytime wear. Coloured gloves were rare for unmarried women, white being the safe choice for almost every occasion. You changed your gloves frequently, kept spare pairs, never appeared in soiled gloves in public. The state of a young woman's gloves was, almost in itself, a statement about the state of her household. Clean gloves, fresh gloves, gloves that fit perfectly, signalled an establishment with the resources and the attention to detail to maintain such standards. Soiled or torn gloves signalled something less. By the end of your second week in London, after multiple visits to the modist, after the seamstresses have come to the house for some of the final fittings, after the bonnet maker has delivered her work and the shoemaker has delivered his, your wardrobe is, more or less, ready. The principal gowns are hanging in your wardrobe, the accessories are arranged in their drawers, the ball slippers are ranked in pairs in the bottom of the cabinet. The court presentation gown, if you are being presented, hangs separately, sometimes in a special cupboard of its own, the most expensive and most laboured-over single object in the entire collection. You stand briefly in your room. with the wardrobe open, looking at it all. There is more clothing here than you have ever owned at one time in your life. There is more money's worth of clothing here than most people in England will see in a year of work. And all of it is for you. All of it has been made for you. All of it is going to be worn in turn, in the rooms you have not yet seen, in front of people you have not yet met, in the service of the long process that has now, almost, begun. If you are being presented at court, and not every debutante was, the day of your presentation is now approaching, and I want to walk you through what that day involved, because it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the strangest social events that has ever existed in English life. Court presentations were held during the season at the Queen's drawing room, the formal reception held by Queen Charlotte, the wife of the ailing king, who continued to hold the formal court functions even as her husband had withdrawn into the private rooms at Windsor, where he was being cared for. Queen Charlotte was by 1814 a woman in her late 60s, plain of face, dignified of bearing, deeply traditional in her view of court ceremony, and absolutely uninterested in adapting court convention to the changing fashions of the wider world. And Topin, this was the central and almost comic problem of the court presentation as it existed in the Regency era. The Queen, rooted in the manners of the previous century, required that those presented to her appear in the formal court dress that had been standard in the 1770s and 1780s. The wider fashion of the world had moved on drastically. The result was that a young woman being presented at court in 1814 had to combine in a single garment the soft, high-waisted classical line of the contemporary Regency style with the enormous wide hoops, the panniers that had been required at court for 40 years. The effect was, by every account of the period, peculiar. You wore a gown with the bust line just under your arms, in the new Regency fashion, but the skirt of that gown was held out 3 or 4 feet wide on either side by the hooped underskirt that the court still required. You looked, in the words of one contemporary observer, like a champagne glass set on top of a tea tray. To this you added the 3 white ostrich plumes that protocol required to be worn in the hair. The plumes had to stand up. They had to be visibly 3. They had to be white. They were attached to a band or comb in the hair and rose vertically above your head, sometimes by as much as a foot, giving the whole figure a strange tapering silhouette of plume above and width below. To the back of the gown was attached the train, several yards of fabric extending behind you, edged with lace, often embroidered, which you were expected to manage with grace as you moved through the rooms. Lappets, the long ribbons of lace that hung from the headdress, framed your face. The whole costume, gown and train and hoops and plumes and lappets was, in the candid words of more than one young woman who endured it, ridiculous. It was also, by court rule, mandatory. The day of the presentation began early. Your dressmaker came to the house, sometimes with 2 or 3 assistants, to put you into the gown and to ensure that everything sat correctly. The plumes were fixed in your hair by a specialist hairdresser who had spent the morning travelling between the houses of the various young women being presented that day. The train was attached. The lappets were arranged. You were, by mid-morning, assembled, and you waited for what could be hours for the carriage to take you and your sponsor to the palace. Your sponsor was the woman, almost always a relative or a close friend of your mother, who had herself been presented at court, and who would now present you. She was responsible for the formal introduction. She would say your name to the Lord Chamberlain at the door, and the Lord Chamberlain would announce you into the room, and the Queen, seated on her chair of state with her ladies in waiting around her, would receive you. The actual ceremony, the moment of presentation itself, took perhaps 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes less. The Queen was old, the day was long, the line of debutantes and other persons being presented stretched on for hours. The actual moment was over almost before it began, but what a moment it was. You walked into the throne room, in your hooped gown and your plumes, with your sponsor beside you, and you advanced toward the Queen with the slow, steady pace that had been drilled into you for weeks. You reached the prescribed point in the room, perhaps 8 or 10 feet from the Queen, and you sank into the deep court curtsy that you had practiced so many times you could do it in your sleep. Knees bent, back straight, head bowed slightly, the dip going almost to the floor and rising again with no perceptible wobble. The Queen extended her hand. You rose, advanced and kissed her hand, or were kissed on the forehead by her if you were the daughter of a peer, the precise gesture varying according to your rank. You curtsied again, and then, and this is where the real test came, you began to back out of the room. You backed out, because court etiquette did not permit you to turn your back on the monarch. You walked backward, in the gown with the 4-foot hoops, with the train you could not see behind you, with the plumes wobbling above your head, all the way back across the throne room to the door. You did this, as you had been taught, by managing the train with a small flick of your foot at the appropriate moment, by the woman immediately behind you whispering directions if you began to drift, by the slow, careful steps that ensured you did not catch your heel and pitch backward into the floor. Some women did fall. The accounts of the period record several such incidents with the kind of horrified attention that suggested the fall of one young woman backward into her own train was an event the entire court would discuss for weeks afterward. You did. You very fervently hoped. Fall. When you reached the door, you curtsied a final time. You turned, and you walked out into the antechamber, where your maid and your mother were waiting to take charge of you. The hoops were unhooked, the train was detached, the gown was carefully gathered up. You sat, for the first time in hours perhaps. You drank a glass of something. The court drawing room was over for you. You were formally presented. You had become, in the eyes of the strict ceremonial law of the realm, an adult young woman who could now appear in society at the highest level. The next time you crossed a ballroom, it was as a person whose name had been spoken in the throne room of St. James's Palace, and that was, in 1814, a status worth the entire elaborate, ridiculous performance. Not every debutante went through this. Many were presented only at the first ball of the season, with a slightly less formal but still significant ceremony of introduction by their hostess. The court presentation was reserved for the daughters of peers, the daughters of senior baronets, the daughters of certain knighted families with court connections, and the daughters of such gentry families as could secure a sponsor with the right relationship to the court. It was a marker of social rank in itself. To have been presented at court was to belong, demonstrably, to the inner circle of English society. To have been a debutante without a court presentation was perfectly respectable, but it placed you on a slightly different rung of the same long ladder. Whichever path you took, the formal entrance into society was now made. From the day of your court presentation, or from the night of your first ball, the rhythm of your London life began. And that rhythm, the day-by-day pattern of the Regency season, is the next thing I want to walk you through, because once you have understood the shape of a debutante's day, you understand most of what the season actually felt like to live through. Mornings during the London season did not begin early. By the standards of the country, where you would have risen at 7 or 8 to take advantage of the daylight, London hours felt almost decadently late. You woke at perhaps 9 or 10 in the morning, sometimes later if the previous night had been a ball that did not end until 4. Your maid drew the curtains. You sat up in bed. A tray was brought in with a small breakfast, often just bread and butter, and a cup of chocolate or tea. The full family breakfast was less universal than country mornings. In London, family members tended to eat in their own rooms or at separate times, depending on the schedule of the day. The morning toilet took perhaps an hour and a half if you were dressing for a major engagement, less if you were simply preparing for morning calls and a walk in the park. You were washed, you were brushed, you were laced into stays, you were drawn into a chemise and a petticoat and a morning gown, and your hair was dressed. By 11 or 12, you were ready to face the day. And the day, for a debutante in the Regency season, was structured around a set of conventions so specific that they functioned almost as a script. The morning, in this slightly counterintuitive city where the morning ran from about 11 to about 3 in the afternoon, was the time for what were called morning calls. This is one of those phrases of the era that confuses modern readers, because the activity it describes did not happen in the morning at all by our reckoning. Morning calls were the formal social visits that ladies paid to one another's drawing rooms during the early afternoon, between roughly noon and 3. The visit was short by convention, 15 or 20 minutes at most. You arrived, were announced by the footman, were received by the lady of the house in her drawing room, made polite conversation about the weather, the previous night's entertainments, mutual acquaintances, and any pieces of harmless news, and then took your leave. You then proceeded to the next house, made another 15-minute call, and continued through the afternoon, sometimes paying as many as 5 or 6 calls in succession. Ja, Kiksen. A whole system was governed by the calling card, a small printed or engraved piece of stiff white paper bearing your name and, after you were married, your husband's name. If the lady of the house was at home and receiving, you were shown up to the drawing room and made your call in person. If she was not at home, or was not receiving callers that day, you left your card with the footman at the door. The card became evidence of your visit. The lady, when she returned the call at a future date, would call upon you, and your acquaintance had then been formally constituted by the exchange of visits. This card-based social bookkeeping was more elaborate than it might first sound. Ladies kept careful track of who had called upon them, who they had called upon in return, who was overdue a call, who had failed to return a call, and was therefore in a small but significant state of social offence. The mother of a debutante was particularly attentive to this bookkeeping. Calls were the connective tissue of the season. They were how relationships were maintained, how new acquaintances were cultivated, how the network of social access through which dance partners and dinner invitations and Almack's vouchers eventually flowed was constructed and maintained. A debutante who failed to make her calls properly was a debutante who would find by mid-season that her dance card was not as full as her contemporaries, and her invitations were not as numerous. You went out, on calling days, in the family carriage, with your mother, and sometimes with another lady of the family, an aunt or an unmarried cousin who served as a chaperone. You wore a walking dress and a pelisse and a bonnet appropriate to the weather, with your gloves clean and your slippers well kept. Your maid did not accompany you on calls. She remained at home, preparing your evening clothes for whatever was scheduled later. The footman travelled on the back of the carriage, ready to descend at each house to announce the family's arrival and to collect or deliver the calling cards as needed. Inside the drawing rooms where the calls actually happened, the atmosphere was almost always the same. A morning room or upstairs drawing room with the curtains drawn back to admit the soft London light. The lady of the house seated near the fireplace, with her work basket beside her, perhaps a piece of needlework in her hand to occupy her between visitors. The footman who showed you up. The polite rising, the greetings exchanged, the seats taken, the small conversation, the gentle ringing of the bell perhaps, for a tray of refreshments to be brought up if the visit was being extended slightly, biscuits and a glass of cordial or a cup of tea, the careful modulated speech of women who were often almost strangers, exchanging a kind of social information whose surface was light and whose subtext was substantive. Because the morning call was not, in fact, frivolous, however much it might appear so, beneath the discussion of the weather, the women in those drawing rooms were exchanging the actual data of the season. Who was in town? Who was rumoured to be in town? Whose daughter had received attention from which young man at the previous Tuesday's ball? Which families had secured invitations to the most coveted upcoming events? Which connections had recently been formed or broken? Who was rich? Who was thought to be rich but was not? Which young men were thought to be looking for a wife this season? Which were known to be running through their inheritances and were therefore not to be encouraged? The morning call was the trading floor of the season's information economy, conducted in voices low enough not to disturb the cat asleep on the hearthrug. You, as the debutante, said relatively little during these calls. The conventions were that the older women conducted the conversation, with you as the polite, well-mannered, attentive young presence in the room. You answered questions when asked. You smiled at the right moments. You did not initiate topics. You did not, under any circumstances, contradict an older lady. You were observed. Word of your manner, your appearance, your apparent disposition would travel back through the network within hours. The morning call was, among other things, an audition you did not entirely realize you were performing. By 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the round of calls was complete. You returned to your house. There was time for a small rest, perhaps, or for changing into the dress you would wear for the next stage of the day. Because in mid-afternoon, in fashionable London, the next great social ritual began. The promenade in Hyde Park. Hyde Park, in the late afternoon of any fine day during the London season, became, for 2 or 3 hours between roughly 5 and 7 in the evening, one of the most concentrated and most observed social spaces in England. The fashionable hour, as it was called, was the time when everyone who was anyone in town came down to the park, in their carriages or on horseback or on foot, to be seen, to see one another, to display the gowns and the carriages and the horses they had brought to London for exactly this purpose. The park was in effect an outdoor drawing room, with the lawns and the avenues serving as a kind of vast public space where the social signalling that happened at indoor gatherings could be conducted on a much larger and more visible scale. The principal location within the park was Rotten Row, a long sandy track running along the south side of the park, named by an old corruption from the French route du Roi, the King's Road. It had been laid down in the 17th century as a private riding path for the royal household, and by the early 19th century had become the most fashionable riding ground in London. Mounted gentlemen rode along it. Mounted ladies, in their elaborate riding habits, rode along it. The carriages of the great families drew up alongside it. People stood on foot, and watched, and were watched. The whole length of the Row, on a fine afternoon in May, was crowded with the social capital of England in motion. You went down to the park, on most fine afternoons, with your mother. The carriage was brought round, you were handed in by the footman, and you proceeded down through the streets of Mayfair, through the gates of the park, and out into the avenues where the rest of fashionable London was already in motion. Your mother, sitting beside you, kept her eyes alert. The carriage moved slowly, by convention, along the agreed route. You did not gallop in Hyde Park. You did not race. You proceeded, at the pace of polite display, with your bonnet adjusted, and your gloves clean, and your manner composed. What you were doing, in the park, was not pleasure in any simple sense. It was a continuation of the social work that the morning calls had begun. You were being shown. The whole point of being seen in the park, on a fine afternoon during the season, was that other people would observe that you were there, that you had been driven by your mother in a respectable carriage, that you were dressed appropriately, that you were composed, that you were a candidate. Young men who had been introduced to you at a recent ball might ride alongside the carriage to exchange polite greetings. Their mothers in the carriages opposite would observe these greetings with attention. Other young women, with their own mothers, would do the same circuit. The whole space was a slowly moving network of small observed transactions. If you rode rather than driving, the picture changed slightly. You wore the riding habit, that splendid tailored garment, almost a coat over a long skirt, that gave you the most masculine and the most authoritative silhouette of any costume you could wear in public during the Regency era. The riding habit was usually deep blue, dark green or dark red, fitted closely at the waist, with mannish lapels and revers, sometimes with epaulettes echoing military fashion, and a high-crowned hat with a feather. The skirt was extremely long, designed to drape almost to the ground when you were in the side saddle, so that no inch of leg or boot was visible. The whole effect on a tall, well-built young woman on a fine horse was striking. Riding was one of the few public situations in which a young woman could appear, without indecency, in a costume that suggested confidence, command, and physical capability. You rode, accompanied by a groom, or by your father, or by an authorized male escort. The side saddle, with its peculiar and slightly precarious arrangement of horns and stirrups, allowed a competent horsewoman to manage even spirited animals on a sandy track in heavy traffic. You rode at the trot, occasionally at the canter, never at the gallop. You smiled at acquaintances. You acknowledged by the smallest inclination of the head the gentlemen who took off their hats to you as you passed. You did not, on Rotten Row, hold long conversations on horseback. The whole thing was movement, brief greeting, continuation. It was social presence in its most distilled form. The park in the fashionable hour was crowded enough to be slow. The carriages backed up at the gates. The riders had to thread between vehicles. Pedestrians stood by the rails and watched. The whole West End on a fine evening was, in effect, on parade. And among the people watching, the mothers and the chaperones and the young women and the young men, there was a constant low-level reading of the scene, who was riding with whom, whose carriage had drawn up alongside whose, which young man had taken his hat off to which young woman a moment longer than was strictly required, which old lady had ostentatiously failed to acknowledge whose. The whole afternoon was, like the morning calls, a transaction of observation, and the same information that had been exchanged in drawing-rooms a few hours earlier was being exchanged again now in different form, in different combinations, with different shades of nuance. By around 7, the fashionable hour was ending. The carriages were turning back. The riders were heading home. The light in May or June was still high, but the time had come to return for dinner. You were driven back to the house. You climbed down. You went up to your room. Your maid was waiting with the dinner gown laid out. And the next phase of the day began. Dinner during the London season was later than country dinner. By 1814, in fashionable households, the hour had crept forward to 7 or 7:30, considerably later than the 4 or 5 o'clock dinner that older country families still kept. Dinner was a formal meal. You were dressed properly for it. You came down to the drawing room before the meal, where you waited with your family for any guests who had been invited. When the butler announced that dinner was served, the gentlemen offered their arms to the ladies in order of precedence and led the company into the dining room. You sat where the place cards directed. The meal proceeded through several courses, served in the formal style of the period, with multiple dishes set out at once on the table for the diners to help themselves and one another. The conversation was conducted at a measured volume, addressed primarily to the persons immediately on either side, though general topics were also raised across the table at intervals. After the dessert was cleared, in the established convention of the era, the ladies rose. You followed your mother and the other ladies out of the dining room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and their political conversation. The ladies retired to the drawing room where coffee was served. The gentlemen would join you, perhaps half an hour later, for tea and further conversation. By 10 or 11, on a quiet evening, you might be ready for bed. But on most evenings of the season, you were not retiring at 10. You were changing, because the second half of your evening, the part of your day that contained the events for which the entire elaborate apparatus had been constructed, was about to begin. It is 10:30 on a Wednesday night in May. You stand in front of the long mirror in your bedroom. Your maid is making the final adjustments to your hair. Your mother is in her own room across the corridor, dressing in her own evening gown, supervised by her own maid. Outside, in front of the house, the carriage is being brought round from the mews. The horses are being put to. Tonight you are going to Almack's. Almack's assembly rooms in King Street, St. James's, were not an aristocratic palace. The building itself was relatively plain by the standards of grand London architecture, a set of large interconnected rooms above a colonnaded ground-floor entrance, with a substantial ballroom, a smaller card room, and a refreshment room. The ballroom was good, but not enormous. The decoration was tasteful, but not lavish. The food, as we will come to in a moment, was famously and almost defiantly plain. From the outside, and even from the inside, Almack's did not look like the most exclusive social space in England. It looked like an unremarkable assembly room of which there were many in London. What made Almack's was not the building. It was the system of admission. Almack's was governed by a committee of women known as the Lady Patronesses. There were, at any given time, between 6 and 8 of them, each of whom held the position by a combination of rank, connection, and personal authority. In 1814, the patronesses included Lady Castlerag, the wife of the Foreign Secretary, Lady Jersey, known throughout fashionable society as Silence, in ironic comment on her famous chattiness, the Princess Esterhazy, the wife of the Austrian ambassador, the Countess Leven, the formidable wife of the Russian ambassador, Mrs. Drummond Burrell, who was considered by her contemporaries the most rigid in her standards, Lady Sefton, who was generally the kindest, and Lady Cowper, who was reputedly the most charming. These 7 women, between them, decided who could and could not enter Almack's during the season. The mechanism by which they exercised this authority was the voucher. Vouchers were the tickets of admission to Almack's, issued at the discretion of the patronesses to applicants whom they considered acceptable. The patronesses met regularly during the season to consider applications. They consulted with one another. They received recommendations from established families. They blackballed individuals they considered insufficiently genteel or insufficiently virtuous or insufficiently well-connected. A young woman who wished to attend Almack's needed her family to apply for a voucher on her behalf, and that voucher might be granted, might be refused, or might be granted in one season and withheld in the next, if some incident or rumour had altered the patroness's view of her family in the intervening months. Possession of a voucher was, in social terms, a public certification of acceptability at the highest level. The absence of one was a quiet, but very legible social judgment. Stories from the period recorded again and again that even the most powerful figures in English life could not always secure entry. The Duke of Wellington himself, returned from the Peninsular War as the great hero of the age, was, according to one of the most famous Almack's anecdotes, refused admission one Wednesday night because he had arrived a few minutes after the doors had closed at 11 and was wearing trousers rather than the prescribed knee breeches. Whether the story is exactly true in every detail is debated, but the fact that it could be told and believed is the point. Almack's enforced its rules. Even on the man who had defeated Napoleon, the patronesses were not running a place where the rules bent for fame or for power. The rules were the place. If your family had secured a voucher for you, that voucher was protected with the kind of care normally reserved for valuable jewellery. You did not lose it. You did not lend it to a friend. You presented it at the door, were checked against the list, and were admitted. Your gown for Almack's was less elaborate than for some of the great private balls, by a kind of unspoken understanding among the patronesses that the rooms were not to become a fashion competition. White, simple, elegant, slippers good but not gaudy, hair dressed neatly with a minimum of ornament. The whole look when you entered the rooms was almost severe. The patronesses preferred it that way. The doors closed at 11 sharp. After 11, no admission. This was the inflexible rule that the Wellington story preserved. If you were not inside by 11, you were not coming in that night. The patronesses themselves, sitting at the entrance to the ballroom, watched the clock. The doors were locked. Whoever was inside was inside. Whoever was outside, however eminent, however angry, however ready to plead, would have to come back next Wednesday. Inside Almack's, the atmosphere was dense, slightly stiff, intensely watched. The orchestra played in the gallery above the ballroom. Couples assembled for the dances. The patronesses themselves circulated, making introductions where they considered them appropriate, refusing to make introductions where they did not. A young man could not approach a young woman directly. He had to be introduced. The patronesses, in effect, controlled who could dance with whom by controlling the introductions. A patroness who liked you could change your season by introducing you to the right partners. A patroness who disliked you could, with no overt action, simply fail to introduce you to anyone interesting, and the evening would be quiet for you, and the rumour would spread that you had stood on the side of the room without dancing, and that rumour would do its slow corrosive work on your prospects. The dances themselves were the stately quadrilles, the more lively country dances, and after about 1815, with formal patroness approval, the waltz. The waltz was, by 1814, in a transitional phase. It had been danced privately and on the continent for years. It was beginning to enter Almack's, but only with the explicit permission of the patronesses, who would, if a young woman was deemed suitable, give her a small nod that meant she was permitted to waltz that evening. To waltz without permission was a serious breach. To waltz with permission was a small social triumph. The waltz, which involved the partners holding one another in close position throughout the dance, was considered by older observers somewhere between immodest and outright shocking. Lord Byron wrote a poem against it. The patronesses, in their wisdom, accepted it gradually as something that the next generation was going to insist upon, and that the institution had to accommodate if it wished to remain relevant. The refreshments at Almack's were famously plain. Tea, lemonade, orgeat, and very thinly cut bread and butter, with stale cake of varying quality. There was no champagne. There was no proper supper. The patronesses had decided at some point in the early 19th century that the rooms were for dancing, not for dining, and that the food should be sufficient to refresh and not sufficient to indulge. People joked about the Almack's bread and butter for decades. They went anyway. Why did anyone go? Why did the most powerful and most beautiful and most fashionable people in England spend their Wednesday evenings in a relatively plain set of rooms eating bad cake under the supervision of a committee of severely judgmental ladies? The answer, of course, is that Almack's was the certification of inclusion. Once you had been seen at Almack's by the people who mattered, you were known to belong. The voucher in your purse, the dance with the right partner under the eye of Lady Jersey, the cup of lemonade taken in the refreshment room with two of your contemporaries, the polite curtsy to the Princess Esterhazy as you departed at 1 a.m, all of these constituted the social proof that Almack's existed, in the end, to provide. You were one of them. The patronesses had said so. For a debutante in her first season, the first night at Almack's was almost as significant as the court presentation. You walked into the ballroom for the first time. You were observed by everyone in the room. You were introduced by your sponsor or by one of the patronesses to a young man, and you danced your first dance under that ceiling. And from that moment on, your season had a centre of gravity. You went to Almack's on Wednesdays. You told your friends in the country, in the letters you wrote in the late mornings of subsequent days, that you had been to Almack's the previous evening. You knew, in your bones, that you had stood inside the most particular and most jealously guarded social space in England, and that the women who controlled it had decided, at least for now, that you belonged there. But the Wednesdays at Almack's were only one element in the larger calendar of evening engagements that filled a debutante's season. The great private balls of the great houses given by the dukes and duchesses and the wealthier earls were where the more elaborate, more expensive, and in many ways more consequential social action of the season took place. And it is to one of those balls on a Friday evening in early June that I want to take you next. You have been preparing in fragments through the day for tonight's ball. The gown was laid out by your maid in the morning. You napped for an hour after the calls, knowing the ball would not end until 4. You ate a light dinner, careful not to be too full to dance comfortably. After dinner, you went up to dress, and your maid spent more than an hour on you doing your hair, threading a fresh ribbon through it, fastening the gown, smoothing the long gloves up over your elbows, slipping your feet into the white satin dance slippers that you had broken in carefully over the past several evenings, so that they would not blister tonight. You were given your reticule, your fan, and your dance card. That small folded paper booklet with a tiny pencil attached to it by a silken string, which would, over the course of the evening, become the document on which the partners for each successive dance were written down. The carriage was at the door at 10:30. You came down the staircase with your mother, your father in his evening dress, the footman holding the door, the cool night air outside coming in through the open hall. Your white gown showed clean against the dark interior of the carriage. The horses moved off, slowly, into the quiet streets of Mayfair, joining the procession of other carriages already converging on the same destination. The destination tonight is one of the great houses. In this case, let us imagine the Duchess of a leading family is giving the ball. Her house is perhaps in Berkeley Square or in Park Lane, set back from the street behind a small forecourt, with a portico over the entrance and an awning extended for the night across the pavement to the curb, so that the ladies could descend from their carriages and pass under cover into the hall. The house was lit, top to bottom, with every window glowing. Wax candles by the thousand in the chandeliers and the wall sconces, their light sufficient to make the room seem almost solid with brightness. The footmen in their full livery, powdered hair, white silk stockings, lined the entrance hall and the staircase. The hostess and her family stood at the head of the great staircase, receiving each arriving party as it ascended. You climbed the stairs slowly, in the line of arriving guests. You curtsied to the Duchess as you reached the top. She greeted you and your mother by name, said something brief and polite, gestured you into the ballroom. You passed through the antechamber, through the open double doors and out into the great room itself, and the spectacle of a London ball at full evening tide opened in front of you. The ballroom was already partly full. 100 or more people, the men in their dark evening coats and white knee breeches and white waistcoats and white cravats tied with the kind of mathematical precision that marked their valets as artists. The women in their evening gowns of every colour the wardrobe allowed, with their jewels and their plumes and their elaborate hairstyles. The orchestra was at the far end of the room, in a small gallery or alcove, tuning their instruments. Long tables along the walls held the banks of candles. The floor, polished and chalked for traction, gleamed under the candlelight. The air was a mixture of perfume, candle smoke, the faint dust of the chalked floor, and as the evening progressed, the warm, slightly damp atmosphere produced by 100 dancers in close proximity in a confined space, lit by more naked flames than any modern fire safety code would tolerate for a moment. You stood with your mother at the side of the room. She nodded to acquaintances. The hostess herself, having received the last of the arriving guests, came down into the room and began to circulate, pausing to introduce gentlemen to ladies whom she thought should be introduced. A young man, perhaps the son of a family known to your father, was brought forward and made the formal bow. Your mother nodded permission. The young man asked you for the next dance. You produced your card. He inscribed his name in the appropriate space. He bowed again, retreated, and you were now committed to dance with him in 20 minutes. The dance card filled up over the course of the next hour. Some partners were known to you, friends of the family, neighbours from the country, men your mother had been quietly cultivating for weeks. Others were new, brought up by the hostess or by other matrons of the room. By the time the orchestra struck up the first dance, your card had perhaps 8 of its dozen lines filled in. The remaining lines might fill during the evening as more partners were introduced, or might remain blank, in which case you would sit out those dances on the chairs along the wall, in conversation with other young women whose cards were also less than full. To be sat out at a ball was not a disaster. To be sat out repeatedly at successive balls was the kind of pattern that mothers of debutantes watched with mounting concern. The dances themselves came in three principal forms during the Regency. The country dances, which had been the staple of English balls for 2 centuries, were communal in structure, involving long lines of couples performing patterned figures in sequence, with each couple progressing down the line and dancing with each other couple in turn. They were lively, social, conversational. You spoke to your partner during the dance, but also briefly to the partners of the other couples as the figures brought you into momentary contact with them. They lasted a long time, 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes longer, and they constituted the bulk of the dancing at most balls. The quadrilles, which had been imported from France, were a more recent innovation, introduced to fashionable English society around 1815, though variations had been danced earlier. The quadrille was a square dance for 4 couples, with 5 distinct figures, danced in sequence, each figure with its own pattern and its own music. The quadrille required exact knowledge. You had to know the figures, you had to know the steps, you had to know the order. Mistakes were noticed. The quadrille was, in its way, a little more exposed than the country dance, because the smaller groups meant that any error was visible to all the other 6 dancers in the set and to the watchers around the floor. And then there was the waltz, that controversial, intimate, electric dance that was, in 1814, just beginning to make its serious entry into the London ballroom. The waltz required you to dance with a single partner throughout, holding him in close position, his right hand at your waist, your left hand on his shoulder, your right hand in his left, the 2 of you turning together around the floor in time with the music. The closeness of the position, by the standards of the era, was almost shocking. There were people, including some of the great aristocratic mothers, who genuinely disapproved of the waltz and would not permit their daughters to dance it. There were others who recognized that the dance was unstoppable, that the next generation was determined to have it, and who managed their own daughter's relationship to it with care. By 1814, at most balls, a few waltzes were played in the course of the evening. The young people who could waltz did so. The young people who could not, or whose mothers did not permit it, sat out. In the middle of the ball, at perhaps 1 in the morning, supper was served. The doors at the side of the ballroom were thrown open, and the company moved through into the supper room, where long tables had been laid with cold meats, lobster, oysters, jellies, ices, fruit, cake, champagne, claret, and all the delicacies that the kitchen of a great London house could produce for the occasion. You were taken in to supper by a gentleman, almost always your last partner in the dance immediately preceding supper, in the established convention. He led you to a chair, brought you a plate, asked what you would care to eat, fetched it for you. You ate modestly and conversed with him. The gentleman who took a young woman in to supper at a ball was, by the conventions of the moment, in a slightly more emphasized position than her other partners. The fact of the supper arrangement was noted. Mothers watched. Aunts watched. Other young women watched. Word of who had taken you in to supper at the Duchess's ball would travel along the morning call network the next afternoon. After supper, the dancing resumed. The waltzes came thicker as the evening progressed. The quadrilles faded. The country dances grew more boisterous as the hour grew later, and the wine had begun to circulate. By 3 in the morning, the rooms were thinning out. The older guests had gone home. The mothers and chaperones were drooping in their chairs along the walls. The dancers themselves were tiring, though the young always tire last. By 4, the orchestra was packing up. The carriages were being brought round in a long line that stretched up and down the street outside, with footmen calling the names of waiting families, and the carriages drawing up in turn. You came down the staircase with your mother, your gown slightly less crisp than it had been when you arrived, your hair beginning to come out of its arrangement, your slippers showing their wear, your fan limp in your hand. You climbed into the carriage. You drove home through the cool pre-dawn air. You climbed the stairs to your room. Your maid, who had been waiting up, helped you out of the gown and into your nightclothes. You crawled into bed. You slept until 11 the next morning. The pattern repeated. 3 or 4 balls a week on the busiest stretches of the season, plus the calls, plus the parks, plus the dinners, plus Almacs on Wednesday, plus on the rest of the evenings, the smaller engagements, a theatre party at Drury Lane, a musical evening at the house of one of your mother's old friends, a small dance at a less grand hostess's establishment, a breakfast which, despite the name, was held in the late morning or early afternoon in a private garden in Chelsea or Richmond, with marquees and a band and ices in the heat of the day. The whole season unfolded as a continuous, almost relentless succession of social engagements that left almost no day unmarked and almost no evening free. Through it all, the question that everyone was actually asking, and that no one mentioned directly, was the question of marriage, which young men were paying attention, which were paying attention to you. Whether their attention was the casual flirtation that meant nothing, or the more sustained interest that suggested something more, or the specific deliberate cultivation that suggested a serious intention, whether their families approved, whether your family approved, whether the financial arrangements that would have to underpin any actual proposal could be made to work. The economics of marriage in the Regency era were, by modern standards, almost startlingly explicit. When a man and a woman married, their families negotiated a marriage settlement, a complex legal instrument that determined what property each side brought to the marriage, how that property would be managed during the marriage, and what would happen to it if either party died, if there were children, if there were no children, if the husband died first, or if the wife died first. The settlement could take weeks of negotiation. Lawyers were involved on both sides. The terms were detailed in the manner of a serious commercial contract. Your father, in arranging your settlement, would offer a portion. The portion was the sum of money or property that you brought to the marriage, drawn from the family's wealth, that became, in effect, the financial foundation of your married life. A modest portion might be a few £1,000s. A large portion, for the daughter of a wealthy family, might be £20,000 or £30,000, which in 1814 was a serious capital sum sufficient to purchase a substantial estate or to provide a very comfortable income for a couple for life. The size of your portion was, openly, one of the central facts of your candidacy. Young men and their families knew approximately what your father was prepared to settle on you. They factored this into their decisions about whether to pursue you. In return, the husband's family would settle on you a jointure, a guaranteed income that would become yours if your husband died before you. The jointure was your insurance against widowhood. Without it, a widow could find herself dependent on her husband's heir, who might be his eldest son by you, or might be a more distant relative, and whose generosity she could not count on. The jointure was the settled income that the family of the husband promised to ensure she would receive, whatever happened. The size of the jointure was, again, negotiated. You would also receive, during the marriage, what was called pin money, a personal allowance paid to you by your husband, ostensibly for your personal expenses, your clothing, your charities, your private affairs. Pin money was the closest thing a married woman had to a salary of her own, money that did not have to be accounted for to her husband in detail, that she could spend at her own discretion. The pin money was again fixed by the settlement at the start of the marriage. A generous pin money of several £100s a year gave you considerable personal autonomy. A small pin money kept you on a tighter rein. Beyond these formal arrangements, there were the less formal, but equally important questions. The husband's prospects, whether he was an eldest son, with the family estate in his future, or a younger son, who would have to make his own way in the army, the navy, the church, or the law, whether his estate, if he had one, was unencumbered or labouring under debt, whether his personal habits, his card-playing, his drinking, his other entanglements, suggested a life of stable management or one of slow ruin. The whole business required, behind the romantic surface, a level of due diligence that any modern banker would recognise. Your role in this, as the debutante, was not to conduct the due diligence yourself. You did not, as a young woman of 19, examine your suitor's accounts. Your father did, your uncle perhaps, your father's man of business. Your role was to indicate, by the signals that the conventions of the era permitted, your own preference, to smile at the gentleman who interested you, to refuse politely the dances of those who did not, to allow the conversations that mattered to develop into something more, while keeping the conversations that did not at the level of pleasant nothings. The actual proposal of marriage, when it came, was made by the gentleman to your father. He called at the house, was shown into the library, made his request formally. Your father, having made his investigations, gave or withheld permission. If permission was given, the gentleman was permitted to address you. He asked you, formally, in some private room of the house, with your mother perhaps in the next room, whether you would accept him. You answered. Your answer, by the conventions of the moment, mattered. A young woman of your station could refuse. Refusals did happen. But the framework of the question, the having been brought to this point by months of cultivation by both families, made the refusal a substantial decision. Most young women, presented with a proposal that their parents had judged acceptable, and that they themselves had reason to think well of, accepted. Some did not. The historical record contains both, and the women who refused were not necessarily punished for it, though the social pressure to accept was considerable. If you accepted, the engagement was announced. The settlements were finalized. The wedding was planned, often for late summer or autumn, after the season had ended. The season for you was effectively over from the moment of the engagement. You no longer attended balls in the same way. You appeared, instead, at the more intimate engagements, dinners with the families of the engaged couple, visits to the country estate of your future husband to be introduced to his tenants and his neighbours, the slow ceremonial transition from one household to another. By the autumn, you were married. By the next season, you were a young matron, no longer a candidate, present at the great events as a wife rather than as a daughter. If you did not accept any proposal that season, or if no proposal came that season, you went home to the country at the end of July or the beginning of August. The season closed, the houses shut, the families dispersed back to their estates. You spent the autumn and the winter in the country. You read, you visited, you wrote letters to your London friends, you waited. And in the following spring, the whole apparatus rolled into motion again, and you came up for your second season. By the third or fourth season without a husband, the question began to be asked, in the back rooms of family discussion, whether something more permanent might need to be planned. But before we get to the end of the season, before we look at what happened to the young women who came up to London in May and went home to the country in August, I want to spend some time with what the actual lived experience of a debutante's season felt like, in its real texture, beneath the surface of the cards and the gowns and the introductions, because the romanticised version of the Regency season, the one we get from films and from a certain strand of historical fiction, has a way of making it all look much smoother and much more pleasurable than the contemporary diaries and letters suggest it actually was. The season was, for many young women, exhausting. It was, for many, anxious in a way that left lasting marks. It was, for not a few, simply the worst experience of their young lives. And the historical record, when you read it carefully, is full of evidence of all of these things, even from women who on the surface seem to be sailing through it. Let me start with the physical exhaustion. The Regency season ran for roughly 4 months, from the spring through high summer. During those months, a debutante in the full social swim of London might attend, on average, 4 or 5 social engagements per week, and on the busiest weeks as many as 10 or 12. She would have been out, on most evenings, until 2, 3, or 4 in the morning. She would have woken, on most mornings, between 9 and 11. She would have lived on a diet of hurried breakfasts in her room, ceremonial dinners she was too anxious to eat, suppers at balls she was too excited to enjoy, and the endless small refreshments at calls and at concerts that kept her body fueled at low and uneven levels. She would have stood, danced, walked, ridden, curtsied, smiled, conversed for hours every day in clothing that, while less constricting than the previous eras, was still tighter than her sleeping clothes and required her to maintain a particular posture and a particular control. By the end of the season, in late July or early August, she was, in many cases, simply spent. Letters from the period are full of the language of exhaustion. The mothers of debutantes wrote to each other about the toll the season was taking, about how peaky their daughters were looking, about how a few quiet weeks in the country would be needed to restore them. The debutantes themselves wrote to friends who were not in town, describing their tiredness with a candour they would not have used in conversation. There was a recognised phenomenon, discussed by the older generation, almost as a medical condition, of the season being too much for some young women, of their being knocked up by the pace of it, of needing to retire early or to skip events to recover their strength. Doctors of the period attended quietly to the headaches, the fainting fits, the mysterious low fevers, the stomach complaints that beset young women through the season. The diagnoses where they were given names at all were vague. The treatments where they existed were palliative. Tea, rest, perhaps a journey to the seaside. The truth was that many of these complaints were, in their own physiological vocabulary, simply what bodies do when they are run too hard for too long on too little sleep. There was also, beneath the physical exhaustion, a more insidious mental strain. The constant performance was, by its nature, depleting. To be on display, every day, all day, in front of audiences whose judgment mattered enormously, and whose verdicts would be relayed to you through the morning call network within hours, was a kind of low-level chronic anxiety that you carried with you into every drawing room. Your gown was right or it was wrong. Your hair was right or it was wrong. Your conversation was right or it was wrong. The young man you danced with was the right one or the wrong one. The dance you accepted was the dance you should have accepted, or the dance you should have refused to leave free for someone better. The judgments were continuous, the data points multiplying, the sense of a permanent record being kept against your name, accumulating with every event. Some young women managed this with native equanimity, the kind of quiet inner stability that simply did not let the surface judgments penetrate. Others did not. The diaries and letters of the period contain evidence of considerable distress. Young women who lay awake at night going over every conversation of the previous evening, passing every gesture, every word, every glance, looking for the moment at which they had failed. Young women who became almost paralyzed in the rooms of Olmax, conscious of the patronesses watching, conscious of the rivals watching, conscious of the mothers watching, unable to move freely in such a saturated field of observation. Young women whose nerves, in the old sense of the word, gave way under the strain, and who had to be taken home early from balls because they had begun to weep in the supper room, or had a dizzy turn and could not continue. The mothers, in such cases, were generally protective. The Regency was not a sentimental era, but it understood that young women had limits, and a daughter who had broken down at a ball was not pushed back into the same room the next night. She was allowed to rest. The doctor was called. The season's pace for her was reduced. A week in the country, perhaps, or a quiet 10 days at the family estate of a relative. The mother who pushed her daughter past the breaking point was, in fact, considered a poor mother by the standards of her contemporaries. Some did push too hard. Most, in the historical record, did not. But for every young woman who broke down visibly, there were a great many more who carried the strain quietly. They arrived home from a ball at 4 a.m, lay in bed without sleeping, watched the dawn come up through the window, dressed at 11, and went out for the morning calls with a kind of half-masked smile that no one really commented on, because everyone in the room wore one like it. The season produced, in this sense, a particular kind of fatigue that was not entirely visible to outsiders. The picture of the Regency ballroom that has come down to us is a picture of brightness and music and graceful figures in motion. Behind it, in the bedrooms upstairs and in the carriages going home, there were a great many young women who were simply tired in a way they did not know how to articulate, even to themselves. What sustained them, more than anything else, was each other. The friendships among debutantes are one of the underdocumented but most important elements of the Regency social world. You came up to London with your mother and your maid, and you found yourself at every event in the company of other young women in roughly the same situation, the daughters of your mother's friends, the daughters of your father's old schoolfellows, the girls you had met during previous summer visits to country houses, the friends from your year at the school in Bath, if you had gone to school. By the second or third week of the season, you had a small circle of contemporaries with whom you danced at the season's balls, sat in familiar drawing rooms, and walked the usual paths in Hyde Park. These friendships could be, and often were, deep. The other debutantes were the only people in your life who actually understood what you were going through. The mother had been through it once 25 years before, and remembered her own season through the inevitably distorting lens of memory and her subsequent marriage. The aunts had their own perspectives, all of which were managerial. The fathers and brothers had nothing useful to offer. The maids were sympathetic, but constrained by their position from being real friends. The other debutantes, alone in this whole landscape, knew. They had stood at the same wall last Tuesday and watched that patroness pass them over. They had received the same cool greeting from that haughty older woman. They had felt that familiar cramp in their dance slippers. They had dressed for that evening's ball that morning, knowing that a particular young man might or might not be in attendance. The friendships were built in stolen moments, the whispered conversation in the powder room while gloves were being adjusted, the walk together in the park, with mothers nodding amiably from neighbouring carriages, the exchanged letter, sealed and delivered by hand between two houses in adjacent streets, full of the kind of frankness that conversation in public could not contain, the sleepover, occasionally, when one young woman was permitted to stay overnight at the house of another, and the two of them sat up half the night by candlelight, talking about everything that had happened that week and everything they hoped or feared would happen next week. The historical record contains correspondence between Regency-era young women that is, in its emotional intensity, almost startling to a modern reader. Letters of declared affection between female friends that read, by modern conventions, almost like love letters. The phrase "my dearest" was used freely. The language of devotion was elaborate. The assertions of permanent attachment were universal. Some scholars have, more recently, read into this correspondence evidence of romantic attachments between women, or bonds that went beyond ordinary friendship, which the era simply did not have a clear category for, and therefore did not police. Others have argued that the language was conventional, that this was simply how women of feeling expressed friendship in the early 19th century, and that to read modern romantic frameworks back into it is to misunderstand the period. The honest answer is probably that both are true in different cases. Some of these friendships were what we would now call romantic. Some were not. All of them were emotionally important to the women involved in ways that often outlasted the season and the marriages that followed it. The letters home to friends who had not come to London for the season are another rich vein of evidence about what the experience felt like from inside. The young woman writing to her cousin in Yorkshire, or to her dearest school friend whose family had not made the trip up that year, allowed herself a frankness in those letters that she would not have used in any drawing room. She wrote about the gowns, yes, but also about the gentleman who had paid attention to her at the Tuesday ball, and whom she found, in private, rather less interesting than her mother thought he was. She wrote about the patroness at Almack's who had been so cold to her at the door that she had nearly cried. She wrote about her exhaustion. She wrote about the worry, which she could not voice anywhere else, that nothing was going to come of any of this, and that she was going to have to come back next year. These letters survive in the family papers of many gentry and aristocratic families, and they are the closest thing we have to the unfiltered voice of the Regency debutante. The picture that emerges from them is more anxious, more uncertain, more emotionally complicated than the surface gloss of the era suggests. These were not, on the whole, women who were having the time of their lives. They were young people doing a difficult job under enormous family pressure, sustained by their friendships with one another, hoping that something good would come of it, sometimes finding what they hoped for, sometimes not. There were, in the worst cases, the darker possibilities that the season's structure made available. A young man whose intentions were not serious might pay enough attention to a debutante to compromise her reputation, then withdraw, leaving her with the appearance of having been pursued without the substance of an offer. A young man whose financial situation was rather worse than he had allowed her family to understand might press a courtship to the point of proposal, only to be discovered later, sometimes after the engagement had been announced, to be pursuing the marriage as a solution to his debts rather than as an attachment to her person. A young man might, more rarely but devastatingly, persuade a young woman of her affections to elope with him to Gretna Green, the Scottish town just over the English border where the marriage laws were laxer, and where a couple could be married without parental consent. The Gretna Green marriage was not in itself illegal, but the family disgrace it represented could be enormous, and the young woman who fled to Gretna with a fortune hunter who turned out to be unworthy of her had, in some cases, ruined her family's prospects along with her own. The figure of the rake or the libertine was real, though he was less common than the novels of the period sometimes suggested. The Regency was not, on the whole, an era of widespread sexual scandal among the marriageable classes, because the structures designed to prevent such scandal were extremely tight, and the consequences of breaching them were severe. But there were exceptions, and the names of those exceptions were known. Lord Byron, the poet, was the most famous example of his generation, a man whose attractive person and considerable charm covered a personal life of such complication that by 1816 his wife had separated from him, and he had left England, never to return. Around Byron orbited a small constellation of the famously scandalous, including Lady Caroline Lamb, the wife of a future Prime Minister, whose pursuit of Byron in 1812 had been so unrestrained that it had become public knowledge and had nearly ruined her reputation. The young Caroline Lamb, before her marriage, had herself been a debutante. The path from the Almack's ballroom to the public scandal of the Byron affair was, in her case, just over a decade long. Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent and the heir presumptive to the throne, was a debutante of a sort herself in this period, and her story was followed in the newspapers and the gossip of London with more attention than any private young woman could imagine. Charlotte, born in 1796, came of age in the early 1810s, was engaged briefly to the Prince of Orange in 1813, and then broke that engagement off in 1814, married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in 1816, and died in childbirth the following year at the age of 21, an event that plunged the country into a mourning that lasted for months, and that altered the succession of the British throne for the rest of the century. Her story, in its happiness and its tragedy, was followed by the women of the season as a kind of magnified version of their own narratives. Charlotte was not, in any real sense, a private person. But her public ordeal, her engagements and her broken engagements, and her marriage and her death, was watched by the debutantes of her era with the kind of attention that suggested they understood her experience as continuous with their own, however different the scale. For most young women in the season, of course, there was no scandal, no rake, no Gretna Green elopement, no public tragedy. There was only the ordinary cumulative experience of 4 months of intense social engagement, ending in one of 3 outcomes. Either you were engaged to be married by the end of the season, in which case the season had done what it was supposed to do, or you were not engaged, but you had been a recognized success in some lesser sense, and you would come back next year with reasonable hope of a better outcome. Or you had not done well, by some combination of bad luck, bad placement, bad timing, or simply not having the qualities that the marriage market that year was rewarding, and the question of what would happen next was one your family was now beginning quietly to consider. By the end of July, in any case, the season was winding down. Parliament was rising. The great families were closing their London houses. The carriages were being loaded. The whole apparatus that had been so carefully assembled in April was being disassembled in August, in reverse, with familiar servants doing familiar work in the opposite direction. The trunks were repacked. The plate was returned to the strong room. The shutters were closed. The knocker was taken off the door. By mid-August, the house was empty. The family had returned to the country, and the season for that year was over. The journey home for most families followed the route in reverse that they had taken up in April. The coaching inns, the posting houses, the slow rolling of the carriage along familiar roads. But the journey home felt entirely different from the journey up. You were coming back changed. You had seen things in the last 4 months that you had not seen before. You had stood in rooms that you had not previously imagined yourself in. You had been observed by the eye of the highest society in England, and that society had returned, in its fragmented and elusive way, a verdict. The verdict, by the time the carriage rolled through the gates of the country house at the end of the long August day, was for most families becoming clear. If you were engaged, the autumn was a season of preparation. The wedding, in most cases, was held quietly, often in the parish church of the bride's family, with only the closest relatives and friends in attendance. The grand society wedding of the modern imagination, with hundreds of guests and a great London church, was rare in the Regency era. Most weddings were small. The bride wore a gown that was often only slightly more elaborate than her usual evening dress, in a colour of her choosing, not necessarily white. The white wedding dress as a universal convention came in only later in the 19th century with Queen Victoria. A Regency bride might wear pale blue, or silver, or cream, or the white that was simply fashionable for young women generally. She was given away by her father. The vows were spoken. The register was signed. The wedding breakfast, which was actually held at midday or in the early afternoon, was eaten in the dining room of the bride's family home. By evening, the bride and groom had departed for their honeymoon, which often consisted of a stay at the country estate of the groom's family, where she would meet her new in-laws and begin the transition to her life as the wife of the family. The wedding, in this sense, was the formal end of the season. Whatever its romance or its absence of romance, the wedding closed the chapter of being a debutante and opened the chapter of being a married woman. From that moment on, your social position was different. You no longer needed a sponsor. You no longer needed permission to dance the waltz. You no longer wore white as a default. You could wear stronger colours, more elaborate jewels, more substantial styles. Your role at future seasons was no longer that of a candidate, but that of a participant, and in time, that of a chaperone for someone else's daughters. You had crossed, in a single ceremony, from one phase of female life to another, and you would not be coming back. Your early married life was, in most cases, conducted between the country and the London house of your husband's family. You spent most of the year on the country estate, learning the management of a great household, the supervision of servants, the cultivation of relationships with neighbours and tenants, the duties of a landlord's wife in a community where the great house was the centre of local life. You wrote to your mother, you wrote to your sisters, you wrote to your friends from the season, and the friendships you had made in the spring continued by post through the autumn and the winter, and into the years that followed. Some of those friendships became the most enduring relationships of your life. Some faded, most settled into the slower correspondence of married women whose lives had diverged but whose original bond remained in some quiet form. If you had a child within the first 2 years of marriage, which most women of your station did, your life as a young wife became almost immediately a life as a young mother, with the additional layer of household management that the nursery required. The pregnancies in this period were frequent. The births were dangerous. The mortality of both mothers and infants was significant. You were lucky if you came through your first confinement without lasting damage to your health. You were luckier still if your child survived its first year. Many women did not, on either count. The reasons women in the Regency were so concerned with making advantageous marriages, why mothers worried so intensely about settlements and jointures and the financial security of their daughters, were not abstract. The death of a husband, the failure of a child, the slow drift of a household into financial trouble were not theoretical possibilities. They were realistic outcomes that had to be planned for, and the marriage settlement was the principal instrument of such planning. But all of this, the wedding and the country estate and the early children and the household management, depended on your having married in the first place. And for a great many young women, the season ended without an engagement, and the autumn of return was a different and more uncertain experience. The young woman who came home from her first season without a proposal was not, in the Regency era, in any kind of immediate trouble. The season was understood to be a process, not a single event. Many young women, perhaps most, did not become engaged in their first season. They came back, they spent the autumn and the winter at the country house, they reflected on what had gone well and what had not. They corresponded with their London friends about the gossip of the autumn, and in the following spring they came up again. The second season was approached with somewhat more experience and somewhat more strategic clarity. The young woman knew which patroness was sympathetic to her family, which gentleman had paid attention the previous year and might pay more this year, which gown suited her best, which dances she danced with the most grace. The second season was, for many, more successful than the first. If the second season did not produce an engagement, the third season was the next opportunity. By the third season, the young woman was perhaps 21 or 22. She was no longer a girl in her first bloom. She was an established figure on the London social scene, known to the patronesses, known to the matrons, known to the eligible bachelors who had been paying attention to the season for several years now, and who knew exactly which young women had been out for how long. To be in one's third season without an engagement was not a disaster, but it began to be a question. By the fourth season, the question began to be asked more pointedly. By the fifth, the young woman was approaching what was, in the unspoken vocabulary of the era, the shelf. To be on the shelf was to be a young woman of marriageable age who had not married, whose prospects were beginning to be openly discussed, and whose family was beginning to consider whether some alternative arrangement might need to be planned. A woman of 25 who was not yet married was not, in 1814, a hopeless case. But she was a case that needed thought. A woman of 30 who was not married was, in the parlance of the period, a confirmed spinster, and the social roles available to her were narrowing. The roles available to the unmarried woman of gentle birth in this era were limited but not absent, and I think it is worth walking through them, because the shadow of these alternatives hung over every season and informed every decision that every debutante and every mother made. The first and most respectable role for the unmarried gentlewoman was that of the maiden aunt at home. You stayed in the family house. You assisted your mother, while she lived, in the management of the household. After her death, you assisted whichever of your married sisters or sisters-in-law took over the family home, or you moved, perhaps, to live with a married sister whose own household needed the help that an unmarried adult woman could provide. You were a figure of dignity in this role, but a figure of dependency. You had no income of your own beyond what your father had settled on you, often a small annual sum sufficient to keep you in clothes and pin money, and you lived in the house of someone else, on terms that were generous but that were, finally, not yours to set. The maiden aunt, in literary memory, became one of the standard figures of 19th century life. She is in Austen, she is in Trollope, she is in Eliot. She is the woman in the corner of the drawing room with her sewing, useful, patient, generally kind, often slightly disappointed in some unspecified way. She raised the children of her relatives. She sat by the bedsides of the dying. She went to the parish church on Sunday morning. She had her circle of older female friends, and she lived a life that was, for a great many such women, a life of considerable real meaning, even if it was not the life they had hoped for at 20. The second alternative was a permanent move to one of the spa towns, principally Bath, but also Cheltenham or Tunbridge Wells. The spa towns had developed through the 18th century into a kind of secondary social network that ran in parallel with the London season, but operated on different principles. Bath was less expensive than London. Bath was less demanding socially. Bath was in particular hospitable to unmarried women of independent though modest income, and to widows, and to families whose finances did not run to the full London apparatus. A woman in her late 20s or early 30s who had not married could move to Bath, take rooms in a respectable street, develop a circle of acquaintance, attend the assembly rooms in the evenings and the pump room in the mornings, and live a life that was sociable, comfortable, and dignified. Many women did exactly this. Bath in 1814 was full of them. The Bath alternative was not without prospects either. The lower stakes social environment of Bath was, in fact, where many women in their later 20s did finally make matches with widowers, with younger sons of the gentry who had inherited some independent income, with naval and military officers home from the war, who were ready to settle into respectable marriage at a more modest level than the great London match would have provided. The Bath marriage was not the London marriage, but it was a marriage, and it founded households that were, in their own way, perfectly happy. The third alternative was, for women whose families could not maintain them indefinitely, paid employment. The most respectable such employment for a gentlewoman was the position of governess in another family's household. The governess, as I mentioned earlier in talking about your own education, was the woman who managed the schoolroom and the early education of the children of a gentry or aristocratic family. The governess lived in the family house, was provided with her board and her room, and was paid an annual salary that was, by the standards of any independent income, very small. She was, in social terms, in the agonizing middle position of being not quite a servant and not quite a member of the family. She ate, often, in her own rooms or with the children. She did not appear in the drawing room when guests were visiting. She wore the clothes she had brought with her, kept clean and respectable but never updated to current fashion. She was, by her position, a woman who had been gentle by birth and who had been forced by circumstance to take wages. The position of the governess was, by all accounts, lonely. The position was also, by all accounts, often the only respectable means by which a gentlewoman of modest family, who needed income, could obtain it without sliding into outright poverty. There was a great many governesses in early 19th century England. The diaries and letters that survive from women in this position are again full of the language of resignation, of hope deferred, of small consolations, of the mild boredom of teaching the same lessons year after year to children who would forget her name within a decade. Some governesses, like the educated and intellectual Anne Bronte in the next generation, used the position as the basis for serious literary work. Most did not. They simply did the job, year after year, until their employers' children were grown, at which point they moved to another family, or, if they had been very fortunate, to a small annuity that allowed them to retire to lodgings in a market town. The fourth alternative was the position of paid companion, similar to the governess, but without the teaching responsibilities. A companion was a gentlewoman of limited means who lived with an older woman, often a wealthy widow, as her constant attendant, providing conversation, reading aloud in the evenings, going out shopping, sitting with her in the long, quiet hours of the day. The position was less demanding intellectually than that of the governess, but was often even more dependent on the personality of the employer. A pleasant employer made the position of paid companion a relatively gentle one. An unpleasant employer made it close to insupportable. The companion, like the governess, lived in the house, ate in the house, was bound by the schedule of the house, and had almost no independent life of her own. These four alternatives, the maiden aunt at home, the move to Bath, the governess, the companion, were the principal options for the gentlewoman who did not marry. Beyond them lay genuinely difficult outcomes, the slide into poverty, the dependence on the charity of distant relatives, the slow disappearance into the back rooms of houses that did not entirely want her. The fear of these outcomes was the engine, in the most fundamental sense, of the entire Regency season. The mother who pushed her daughter through 4 months of balls and morning calls and Almack's vouchers was beneath the surface management of dance partners and gowns, fighting for her daughter's economic future in a world that offered no other reliable mechanism for securing it. The season was, for all its surface frivolity, deadly serious. The serious women, the mothers who had been through it themselves and who knew what was at stake, took it as seriously as a banker takes the management of a great estate, because it was, in its way, the same kind of work. I do not want to leave the picture entirely shadowed, though, because the truth is that most young women of the Regency gentry did, in the end, marry. Most marriages, while economically structured, were also affectionate. Most husbands and wives, after a few years together, settled into the kind of partnership that grew real warmth between them, even where the initial attachment had been mild or arranged. The sentimental letter, the shared joke, the long quiet companionship of a couple who had lived in the same house for 30 years, all of these were as common in the Regency household as the cold marriage of convenience that the satirists liked to caricature. The marriages produced by the season were, on the whole, the marriages that founded the families that ran England for the next several generations. Some of them were unhappy. Most of them were, in the practical sense, functional. A few of them were genuinely loving from the start, and grew more so over the years. the young woman who survived her season and married well and settled into the country house and bore her children and managed her servants and grew in her 30s and 40s into a confident matron of the kind that her own mother had been, did not, in the great majority of cases, look back on her debutante years with regret. She remembered the exhaustion, but she also remembered the friends, the gowns, the music, the moment of her first dance, the sound of the orchestra at her first ball, the candlelight in the great drawing rooms, the carriage rides through the park in the long evenings of June. She remembered by the time she was 30 that the season had been, for all its strain, something extraordinary, and she watched when her own daughter's time came around, with the strange double awareness of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen and could not prevent any of it. I want to spend some time now with the specific human figures who populated the world of the Regency season, because so much of what I have described to you so far has been the structure of the thing, the conventions and the calendar and the mechanisms. The season was, in the end, made by the people who moved through it, and a few of those people are worth walking up close to, because their personalities and their decisions shape the experience for everyone around them. Let me start with the patronesses of Almack's, because I introduced them earlier as a committee of women, and they deserve more than that. They were, individually, among the most fascinating women of the era. Lady Jersey, the woman ironically nicknamed Silence, was the daughter of the wealthy banker Robert Child, and her financial independence in her own right was substantial. She had inherited, in 1806, a controlling interest in Child's Bank, the great London bank that had been one of the foundations of the 18th century financial revolution. Most of the patronesses of Almack's exercised authority through marriage and rank. Lady Jersey exercised authority through marriage, rank, and, additionally, the ownership of a major bank. She was, by all contemporary accounts, beautiful, charming, energetic, and almost incessant in her conversation. The nickname Silence was given to her by her contemporaries with the affection that fashionable society reserved for its own. She was not unkind. She was, by all reports, one of the kinder patronesses to debutantes who came from less well-connected families. Her support, when given, made the difference for several young women whose seasons might otherwise have languished. Lady Castlereagh was different. The wife of the Foreign Secretary who was, in this period, conducting the negotiations that would settle Europe after the defeat of Napoleon, she carried the gravitas of a political wife at the very centre of national affairs. She was a substantial woman, both physically and personally, formidable rather than charming, and her judgments were respected because they were known to be careful. The Castlereagh's London house was, in its own way, the centre of the diplomatic season as much as Almack's was the centre of the social one. Foreign ambassadors, statesmen, the great political figures of the era passed through her drawing rooms. To have Lady Castlereagh's approval was to have, additionally, a kind of political endorsement. To lack it was to lack something significant. The Princess Esterhazy and the Countess Leven, the wives respectively of the Austrian and Russian ambassadors, brought the perspective of continental Europe to the patronesses' table. Both women were of aristocratic continental background. Both were sophisticated in the diplomatic codes of their husbands' courts. Both had spent their adult lives moving between London and Vienna and St. Petersburg, and both brought to Almack's an awareness that the social conventions of the English season were one example among several of how aristocratic societies organised themselves. The Countess Leven, in particular, became one of the great political and intellectual figures of 19th century Europe, with a correspondence that included most of the major statesmen of her generation, and her involvement in the patroness's decisions added a layer of international perspective that pure London society could not have generated on its own. The remaining patronesses, Mrs. Drummond-Burrell, Lady Sefton, and Lady Cowper, completed the committee. Mrs. Drummond-Burrell was the strictest and the most rigid in her standards, the patroness whom debutantes most feared, and against whose disapproval there was little appeal. Lady Sefton was, by general agreement, the kindest, the patroness most likely to give an introduction to a young woman whose family was not quite of the first rank, but who had presented herself well. Lady Cowper, the youngest of the group, was charming, intelligent, and politically connected through her family, the Lambs, who included her brother Lord Melbourne, the future Prime Minister, and her sister-in-law Caroline Lamb, whose pursuit of Byron in 1812 had been the great scandal of recent years. The figure of Caroline Lamb is worth pausing on because her trajectory illustrates almost every danger of the Regency season raised to its most public possible pitch. Caroline had come out as a debutante in 1804, had married William Lamb in 1805, had become one of the leading hostesses of the Whig political circle, and had then in 1812 formed an attachment to Byron that became, almost within weeks, the public scandal of London. Her letters to Byron, her appearance at his door in disguise, her refusal to be ignored, her published novel that thinly fictionalized the affair, her continuing presence at the same balls that he attended even after the affair had ended, all of these were the kind of behaviour that the Regency social system was, in many ways specifically designed to prevent. She was not technically ostracised. The Lamb family was too powerful for that, but she was watched, talked of, and discussed with the kind of attention that turned every appearance she made for the rest of her life into a public event. She died in 1828, at the age of 42, having outlived her marriage in everything but the formal sense, and her example was held up to debutantes for the rest of the century as the warning of what unmanaged passion could do to a young woman who had begun her season with every advantage. Princess Charlotte, the heir presumptive to the throne, occupied a particular position as both insider and outsider to the season. She was, in formal terms, beyond the social hierarchy that organized everyone else. The patronesses did not assess her. The dance partners did not need to be introduced to her. Her court presentation was meaningless because she was the future court. But she was, in another sense, the most observed young woman in England, and her movements, her appearances, her engagements, her marriage prospects were the subject of public discussion in a way that no private debutante could imagine. Charlotte, by all contemporary accounts, was a young woman of considerable spirit, somewhat awkward in formal settings, prone to friendships with women of her own age that the court did not always approve, deeply attached to the few intimates she trusted. Her engagement to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in 1816, after she had broken off the earlier engagement to the Prince of Orange, was understood by the country as an unusually happy royal match. Their marriage, conducted in May 1816, was watched with the kind of attention that royal weddings always received. Their happiness, in the brief year and a half before her death in November 1817, was, by all accounts, real. Her death in childbirth, with the loss of her son as well, was the great public tragedy of the late Regency. The country went into mourning, shops closed, black ribbons appeared on doors. The season the following spring was muted, and the question of the succession, which her death had reopened, was settled only by the marriages of her uncles, particularly the Duke of Kent, whose daughter Victoria, born in 1819, would eventually take the throne in her place? Charlotte's story, watched from inside the season by the debutantes of her cohort, was a reminder that no level of privilege protected anyone from the medical realities of the era. Childbirth was dangerous. Death rate among aristocratic women in their 20s from causes related to childbirth, complications of pregnancy, postpartum infection, the difficult deliveries that the medical profession of the era could not always manage, was significant. The young women dancing at Almack's in the spring of 1814 were, in the great majority of cases, 3 or 4 years from their first confinement. Some of them would not survive it. They knew this. The whole apparatus of the season, with its emphasis on settlements and jointures, and the careful protection of the wife's economic position, existed in the shadow of these statistics. Marriage was not an abstract romantic commitment. It was the entry into a phase of life with real physical risks, and the Regency mind, however much it dressed up the romance, did not forget the risks. Outside the social calendar of balls and morning calls, the season offered other forms of cultural engagement that I have not yet mentioned in detail. The opera, in particular, was a fixture of the fashionable evening. The King's Theatre in the Haymarket, which housed the Italian opera, was the principal venue. The opera was attended in dress, with the families occupying their boxes, and the boxes themselves were leased for the season by the great families, and were in effect additional drawing rooms attached to a major cultural performance. You attended the opera not so much to listen to the music, although you did listen, as to be seen and to see in the slightly different social register that the opera provided. The boxes were arranged so that you could observe the boxes opposite, identify the parties in them, follow the slow circulation of visitors who moved between boxes during the intervals. The opera was a kind of evening that combined music, theatre, and social information in a particular distinctive mixture. The theatre, similarly, was a regular evening engagement, with Drury Lane and Covent Garden offering productions of Shakespeare, of new comedies, of melodrama, of the various entertainments that the London stage provided. The famous actors of the era, Edmund Kean as Hamlet at Drury Lane, Sarah Siddons in her later great tragic roles, John Philip Kemble in his stately classical performances, were attended by the fashionable as cultural events that were also social ones. The boxes at the theatre, like the boxes at the opera, were positions of display as much as of viewing. The lending library was, for a young woman in a London season, one of the quieter but more meaningful institutions in her life. Hookham's Library in Old Bond Street, Lane's Minerva Press, the various circulating libraries that operated in fashionable streets across the West End lent novels and other reading material to subscribers for an annual fee. The lending library was where you got the latest novels of the season, the new poetry, the travel books, the histories and biographies that constituted the regular reading of an educated young woman. You might visit the library 2 or 3 times a week during the season, returning your previous volumes, browsing the new arrivals, exchanging quiet recommendations with other young women you encountered there. The novels you read in the long mornings before the calls began, sitting in the morning room with your feet up on a stool, were one of the few activities of the season that was entirely your own. The author you were reading, perhaps Maria Edgeworth, perhaps Fanny Burney, perhaps the new author whose first novel had come out anonymously in the year your season was running, the new author who had given her name only as a lady, who had written a small, sharp comedy about 3 sisters and an officer and a clergyman, an author you would not have known to be Jane Austen, gave you the company of a mind that was not directly involved in the management of your candidacy. Reading, in this sense, was the small private life that the season permitted you to keep. The accomplishments, the music and the drawing and the languages that you had been trained in for years became in the season the substance of your domestic evenings between engagements. On a quiet evening at home with no ball to attend, your mother might ask you to play the pianoforte for the family. You sat at the instrument, in the drawing room with the candles lit and the curtains drawn, and you played the pieces you had learned, perhaps a sonata of Mozart, perhaps a song with words by Burns or by Moore, and your mother and your father and any visiting relative listened. Your sister, if you had one, might sing while you accompanied. You drew in the afternoons sometimes sketches of the rooms in the house or of the garden through the window, in pencil or in watercolour, the lessons of years now turned into the small private record of your days. You read in French. You wrote letters in French to a French émigré friend of the family. Your knowledge of the language a quiet competence that made the war years' separation from continental culture feel less complete. The accomplishments were real. They were not, despite the satirical treatments they sometimes received, mere display. They were the texture of a young woman's private intellectual life, a texture whose materials had been provided by the educational program that the family had invested in for a decade, and that now paid out in the small cultivated evenings that happened between the more public events of the season. This was, in the end, the part of the season's life that the romanticized picture often missed, and the satirical picture also missed. The actual experience of being a debutante was not, most of the time, the dramatic moment of the dance with the eligible gentleman or the encounter with the disapproving patroness. It was the smaller texture of the days, the morning waking, the quiet hour with a book before the maid came to dress you, the drive down to Hookham's in the early afternoon to return a novel and pick up a new one, the half hour at the pianoforte before dinner, working on a passage that you had been struggling with, the letter to your sister, in the country, in your own hand, on your own paper, sealed with your own wax, sent in the morning post, the walk in the garden of the London square that your house overlooked, in the slow light of the early evening, with the railings hung between you and the world, and the trees giving the air the small green coolness that even Mayfair could provide on the right night. The season was made of these moments as much as it was made of the great events. Maybe more. The great events were the structure, the moments were the texture, and the texture, for the women who lived it, was where the actual experience of being alive in those 4 months was most fully present. The world we have spent the evening inside, the world of the Regency season in 1814, did not end in 1814. The season as an institution continued through the rest of the 19th century and in transformed forms into the 20th. But the specific texture of what we have been describing, the muslin gowns and the ostrich plumes at court and the Wednesday vouchers for Almack's, did change, and I want to spend the last part of the evening with what happened to it. The first thing that changed was the court itself. Queen Charlotte, whose drawing rooms had governed the formal presentations of debutantes through the long Regency period, died in 1818. Her husband, the old king, died in 1820. The Prince Regent acceded to the throne as George IV, ruled for 10 years, died in 1830, and was succeeded by his brother William IV, who reigned for 7 years before being succeeded in turn in 1837 by his 18-year-old niece Victoria, The accession of Victoria opened a new era in almost every dimension of English public life, and the season was no exception. Victoria, when she came to the throne, was almost the same age as a debutante in her first London season. She was in many ways a kind of national debutante in the early years of her reign. The court she established after her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 was different in tone from the courts of her uncles. It was domestic, sentimental, deeply committed to the appearance and the substance of family virtue, and it imposed on the formal presentations a slightly different atmosphere from what had prevailed in the time of Queen Charlotte. The hoops gradually disappeared from court dress. The gowns evolved, though the long trains remained. The ostrich plumes remained. The deep curtsy remained. The presentations themselves, however, took on the moral seriousness of the Victorian court, and the season as a whole began its slow transformation from Regency frivolity into Victorian propriety. Almack's, that pillar of Regency exclusivity, declined through the 1830s and 1840s. The patronesses themselves grew older, were replaced by less powerful successors, and the institution lost its grip on London society as the gravitational centre of the season shifted away from a single set of assembly rooms toward the great private balls of the leading hostesses. By 1860, Almack's was no longer the centre of fashionable London. By 1880, the rooms themselves had been put to other uses. The institution that had defined the social season for 2 generations had effectively dissolved, replaced by the more decentralized but equally formidable network of great house entertainments that the Victorian aristocracy preferred. The court presentations themselves continued in the form Victoria had established until well into the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth II held her last formal presentations in 1958. The decision to end the practice was made on grounds of modernization, of reducing the role of the court in regulating who could be considered fashionable society. The 1958 decision marked the formal end of more than 2 centuries of the practice of formal court presentation as a step in a young woman's social life. It was, by then, an institution that had become, for many in the country, an embarrassment. The young women being presented in 1958 were the daughters of a much narrower social class than the system had served at its peak, and the country at large no longer recognized the categories the system enforced. The season itself, however, continued, and continues in its transformed form to this day. The London social season of the early 21st century, with its calendar of events including the Chelsea Flower Show, the Royal Ascot Race Meeting, the Henley Royal Regatta, Wimbledon, the Opera at Glyndebourne, the Polo at Cowdray Park, is the direct lineal descendant of the calendar that brought your family to London in 1814. The events have changed. The dress codes have changed. The function of the season as a marriage market for young women has, very largely, ended. But the rhythm of late spring and early summer in London, being the time when the wealthier classes converge on the capital and engage in a particular set of social activities together, that rhythm persists. The names have shifted. Almack's has become, perhaps, a private members' club in Mayfair. The court drawing room has become perhaps the Queen's garden party at Buckingham Palace. The Wednesday voucher has become perhaps the invitation to a particular charity ball, where attendance is itself the credential. But the form, the seasonal pulse of fashionable London converging on its own social calendar, is the same form. Debutante balls themselves, as a particular institution, have not entirely disappeared. The Queen Charlotte's Ball, named after the Queen whose drawing rooms had governed presentations in the Regency era, was discontinued in 1976, but has been revived in recent decades in private form as a charity event with social overtones, attended by young women who are introduced into a kind of contemporary fashionable society that, while different in many ways from the Regency original, recognizes itself as a descendant of it. Debutante balls in other countries, in Vienna, in Paris, in New York, in various European and American cities, continue as institutions whose details vary, but whose underlying form of young women being formally introduced into adult society in a particular ceremonial way is recognizable across the centuries. The deeper continuities are perhaps less visible, but more substantial. The basic structure of the season, in which a particular age cohort of young people is brought together in a concentrated period of social activity for the purpose of pairing off into marriages, is older than the Regency by many centuries and continues, in the modern forms, to organize much of human social life. The university years function, in many societies, as a kind of extended season. The particular workplaces that bring young professionals together in early adulthood function similarly: the summer holiday resorts, the festivals, the cycle of weddings that any young person's late 20s contains. All of these are versions of the same impulse to provide a structured environment in which the next generation can find its partners. The specific elaboration of the Regency season was historically unusual, but the underlying social function it served has not gone away. What has gone away, in the modern world, is the centralized authority that the Regency season represented. The patronesses of Almack's were a small group of women whose individual judgments determined the social acceptability of an entire generation of debutantes. There is no equivalent today. The patronesses of contemporary social life are diffused, decentralized, and partial. Influence is distributed across many networks, many platforms, many smaller circles. No one person, or committee of 7 persons, decides who is allowed into the rooms where the next generation pairs off. The result is a more open and more chaotic social structure, with both the freedoms and the disorientations that openness entails. Lady Jersey, in her drawing room in 1814, had a kind of authority that no individual woman in 2024 could possibly possess over the social formation of strangers' daughters. Whether this is, on balance, a gain or a loss depends entirely on whose perspective one is taking. The other transformation worth marking is the slow change in the position of women themselves through the long 19th and 20th centuries. The Regency debutante stood at the threshold of a life in which the principal economic decision available to her was the decision of which man's name she would take, and even that decision was hedged about by family approval and financial settlement. The young woman of equivalent age and class today stands at the threshold of a life in which she is expected to make her own way professionally, to support herself if she does not marry, to choose whether to marry at all, and whether to have children regardless of her marital status, to develop her own income and her own career and her own independent identity in the world. The economic substrate of her existence is fundamentally different from that of her great-great-grandmother. The marriage decision, when she makes it, is no longer the financial decision of her life. It is one decision among several. The shadow of the spinster's economic precariousness, which haunted every Regency debutante and her mother, has lifted. A young woman who does not marry today does not, in most circumstances, face the slow descent into dependence that would have been her predecessor's likely path. This is, by almost any measure, an extraordinary improvement in the freedom of women. The Regency season was, in retrospect, an institution made necessary by the absence of any other reliable means by which a young woman of the gentry could secure her economic future. The end of that institution, or rather its evolution into something much less weighty, has been one of the great quiet liberations of modern life. The young woman of 2024 who reads about the Regency season as historical curiosity is, in a sense, reading about the world that the women of the previous 200 years worked, often without explicit awareness of what they were doing, to dismantle on her behalf. She inherited the dismantling. The season she might attend today is largely a matter of choice and pleasure, not necessity. That is a substantial inheritance. But there are also things I think that we have lost in the transition, and I want to name them carefully without sentimentalizing them. The Regency season, for all its constraints, did certain things that the modern social world does not always do as well. It brought a generation together in physical proximity for an extended period. It required attention to one's appearance, one's manner, one's conversation, in a way that produced a kind of social literacy that has, in some quarters, atrophied. It produced friendships among young women in a setting of shared experience that, while constructed for purposes other than friendship, did in fact constitute lifelong bonds for many. It marked the transition into adulthood with a ceremony that gave the transition meaning. It provided, in its own peculiar way, a kind of public acknowledgement of the seriousness of becoming an adult woman that the modern world, which has spread the transition across years and provided no particular public marker for it, often does not provide. The young woman of 1814, with all her constraints, knew when she had become an adult. She had been presented. She had attended her first ball. She had begun her season. The young woman of 2024, with all her freedoms, often does not have a comparable moment of public acknowledgement that she is now an adult woman with the responsibilities and the standing that adulthood entails. Whether the trade is worth it is, I think, an open question. Most people who think about it carefully would say yes, the freedom is worth it. But the cost is real, and worth at least naming. The mothers and daughters of the Regency, the old women who taught the young women how to curtsy, the patronesses who watched the doors of Almack's, the dressmakers in their fitting rooms with their pins in their mouths and their measuring tapes around their necks, all of these built the world we have spent the evening inside. They built it for reasons that were specific to their own historical moment. They built it with the materials they had. They produced between them an institution that was, in its strange and partly beautiful and partly oppressive way, one of the most distinctive social inventions of the early 19th century. And they handed the institution down to their daughters, who modified it, and who handed it down to their granddaughters, who modified it further, until the institution had transformed almost beyond recognition into the looser, more permissive, more egalitarian set of arrangements under which young women now make their way into adult life. And the cycle, which is one of the things I find most fascinating about institutions of this kind, simply continued. The next spring, that machinery rolled into motion again. New debutantes, 18 years old, were being prepared in country houses for their own first season. Their mothers, some of whom had been your contemporaries when you yourself first came up, were now the senior generation, supervising their own daughters' wardrobes, writing their own letters of sponsorship, paying their own morning calls in carriages along those Mayfair streets. The patronesses sat at the head of the Wednesday assemblies at Almack's. The hostess of the great house in Berkeley Square gave her customary balls with familiar orchestras in the gallery and supper served on long tables as before. Some of the debutantes who had been your friends in your first season were now married women, returned to London with their husbands, attending many of those events now as participants rather than as candidates, their own daughters still in nurseries, the next round of the great cycle visibly forming in the houses around you. What this means, when you stand back and look at it, is that the Regency season was not an event, but an institution in the deepest sense. It was a self-renewing structure that produced year after year similar outcomes through familiar processes, with the participants gradually rotating through roles. You moved, in a span of perhaps 15 or 20 years, from debutante to young matron to mother of debutantes to senior chaperone to, eventually, one of the older women who watched the whole performance with the strange affection of someone who had been through every stage of it. Some women, the most formidable of them, eventually became patronesses themselves, sitting at the door of Olmax signing the vouchers, deciding the fates of young women whose grandmothers had once decided theirs. The institution, in this sense, replicated itself through bodies. The bodies grew older. The institution stayed young. I want to spend a little more time with one figure in this larger picture, because I think she deserves the attention. The woman who had been through her own season, perhaps successfully, perhaps not, and who was now, in her 40s or 50s, one of the senior managers of the institution itself. She had a particular kind of authority. She knew exactly what was happening on the dance floor at any given moment, because she had stood there herself 30 years before. She knew which young men were serious and which were trifling, because she had observed their fathers do similar things in their day. She knew the tells. She knew which mothers were exaggerating their daughters' prospects. She knew which young women were as poised as they appeared and which were faking it to keep the family hopes alive. Nothing was hidden from her. The whole performance, transparent to her in a way it could not be transparent to anyone who had not lived through it, was something she watched with what was, at its best, a kind of compassionate vigilance. These women, the senior matrons of the Regency season, were among the most powerful figures in English social life. Their power was not formal. They held no offices. They did not write laws. But the consequences of their judgments rippled outward in ways that could change the futures of dozens of young people every year. A patroness who refused a voucher could end a young woman's prospects for that season. A matron who let it be known, over morning tea, that she did not consider a particular young man a suitable match for her own daughter could damage that young man's standing across an entire network of houses. The signals these women sent, by the smallest gestures of inclusion or exclusion, by the warm or cool word in passing, by the introduction made or pointedly not made, governed the operation of the season as completely as any official set of regulations could have done. This was, I think, one of the few areas of public life in early 19th century England in which women held substantial real power. They could not vote. They could not, with very few exceptions, hold property in their own names once they married. They could not stand for Parliament. They could not, in most professions, hold positions of any kind. But within the season, within the social world that decided who married whom and who was admitted to what, they ruled almost without check. The men who attended these events, the husbands and brothers and fathers and suitors, deferred to the women's judgments on every question that mattered. The architecture of the season had been designed by women for the management of women's lives, and the men were, in most respects, the visitors. That is one of those quiet ironies of an era often described as the most patriarchal stretch of recent English history. Within the structure of the season, the patriarchs were almost guests. The matriarchs ran it. So let me bring us back before the night is over to where we began, to that young woman in 1814 with the card on the silver tray, because I want to leave you with her, not with the institutions that surrounded her, but with the actual person, on the morning after her last ball of the season, sitting in the carriage that was carrying her home. Imagine yourself in that carriage. The London season is ending. The trunks have been loaded again, the same trunks that came up in April, spray-packed now with gowns that are slightly less new, and slippers that are entirely worn through, and gloves that have been replaced and replaced and replaced through the long 4 months of constant use. Your maid is on the box with the coachman. Your mother is sitting opposite you, in the corner of the carriage, with her bonnet slightly tipped forward and her eyes already half closed. Your father has gone ahead, riding, with one of your brothers. You are in the carriage with your mother, and the streets of Mayfair are sliding past the window, and you are leaving the city for the year. You are tired in the particular way that the end of a Regency season produced tiredness. Not the brief tiredness of a single late night, but the deep cumulative tiredness of 4 months of sustained social effort, the kind of tiredness that settles into the bones and that you know instinctively is going to take weeks of country quiet to lift. Your eyes are heavy. Your hands in their travelling gloves are folded in your lap. You watch the city pass. You are leaving also, with the verdict of the season either decided or not yet decided. Perhaps you are engaged, in which case the autumn ahead is the autumn of preparation for your wedding, and you are leaving London as a young woman with her future settled in the way that young women of your generation hope to settle theirs. Perhaps you are not engaged, but have been a recognized quiet success, and you will come back next year. Perhaps you are not engaged, and were not a success, and the question of what next is now an open one in your family. Whichever of these you are, the carriage is moving, and the city you have lived in for 4 intense months is becoming, again, a place outside the window rather than the place you live. The streets thin out. Mayfair becomes Hyde Park Corner, and the great expanse of the park you have driven through so many times opens for the last time on your left. The horses move past it. The road becomes the Knightsbridge Road, then the Kensington Road, then the long western road that leads out of the city into the suburbs and the open country beyond. The houses become more scattered. The fields begin to appear between them. The smell of the city, the coal smoke and the horse droppings and the sheer concentrated humanity of the metropolis gives way gradually to the cleaner air of the surrounding country. I want you to picture, as you sit there in the carriage, what you are taking with you. Not the trunks. The trunks are above and behind, full of clothes and shoes. I mean what you are taking inside yourself. You are taking the music, the orchestras at the great balls, in their galleries above the dance floors, played a kind of music that you had not previously heard in the country. Mozart, played by professional musicians on good instruments in rooms designed for sound. You sit in the carriage now and you can still hear, almost, the strains of the last quadrille at the Duchess's ball 3 nights ago, the way the violins came in just before the cellos, the way the dance figures lined themselves up to the rhythm of the music, as if the music had been written for the figures, and the figures had been built around the music. You will play those tunes in the country, on your own pianoforte, in the long winter evenings ahead. The music will follow you home. You are taking the friendships. the other debutantes, the young women with whom you have stood at the wall during 100 dances, with whom you have whispered through the powder room interludes, with whom you have walked through Hyde Park in the slow evenings of June, are now scattering back to their own families and their own country houses in Yorkshire and Devon and Norfolk and Cumberland. You will write to them. You will hear from them. Friendship that you formed in the spring will continue by post through the autumn into the winter, and the women you danced beside in your first season will, some of them, be the friends you keep for the rest of your life. Whatever happens to you, whatever marriages you make or do not make, whatever children you bear or do not bear, those friendships will be in the background of your life, woven into your correspondence, surfacing whenever you and they happen to come up to London again, the long quiet underneath of the eventful surface. You are taking the candlelight. The way a great London ballroom looks, lit by 1,000 wax candles, with the chalked floor catching the light, the gowns of the dancers holding the warmth of the flames, the air of the room slightly thickened with smoke and heat and perfume by midnight, the whole space turned briefly into a kind of luminous interior that no daylight could ever produce. You will remember that quality of light. You will, in the country, light fewer candles in fewer rooms, and the country evenings will be darker. But you will know, having seen it, what was possible. You will know what a great room can look like when a great household is determined to make it so. You are taking the lessons, not the formal lessons of how to curtsy or how to carry yourself or how to manage a fan, although those are with you too. The deeper lessons of how to be in a room full of strangers without being lost in it. How to smile at the people you do not like as politely as at the people you do. How to keep your composure when the patroness has cut you in the doorway. How to write a letter the next morning that does not refer to the cut, but that reaches its intended recipient with the warmth of someone who has not been wounded. How to keep your fear off your face. How to keep your hope off your face. How to hold yourself, in short, in the public spaces of your own life with the kind of self-possession that the season demanded, and that, having demanded it, the season also produced. You are leaving London with a layer of social skill that the country girl of last March did not have. The skill will fade if you do not use it, but it has been laid down in you, and it will not entirely go away. You are taking the knowledge of yourself, because 4 months of sustained intense social pressure does, whatever else it does, teach a young woman a great deal about who she is. You know now what kind of company you can hold, and what kind exhausts you. You know which conversations leave you energized and which leave you drained. You know how you respond to attention from young men, both the kinds you like and the kinds you do not. You know what you want, more or less, in the way of a future, even if the parts of that future you have any control over are limited. You know yourself in a way that, before the season, you did not. The girl who came up to London in April is not, exactly, the woman who is going home in August. The season has changed you. The change is not entirely visible from outside, but you can feel it in the way you are sitting in the carriage now, in the small interior settledness that was not there before. Your mother, in the opposite corner, has fallen asleep. You watch her for a moment. Her face in repose looks older than you usually see it, the lines around the eyes more visible, the grey in her hair more apparent under the bonnet. She has, you realize, worked harder this season than you have. The introductions, the calls, the careful management of the calendar, the corresponding with the dressmaker and the housekeeper, the long, slow work of bringing you to this moment, all of it has gone through her, and she is the person it has tired most. You think, with a kind of quiet, new understanding, that she did this for you, that her exhaustion is in some real sense the price of the season she has given you. Whatever the season has produced, she made it happen. You will, in the years ahead, do this for your own daughter, if you have one. The work will pass from one generation of women to the next, the way it has always passed. The carriage rolls on. The afternoon light begins to lengthen. The country, properly speaking, has opened around you now, the long fields of August. The hedgerows heavy with their summer growth, the harvest beginning here and there in the larger farms, the cattle in the meadows lifting their heads as the carriage passes. You have come by mid-afternoon into the second county of the journey. The light is the long, late light of summer England, the light that holds steady for hours before it begins to go down, the light that the painters of the era loved, because it gave them so much time to work in. You watch the country pass. You feel in the smallest physical way the weight of London beginning to lift off your shoulders. I want to say something to you now about what stays with the women who lived through the Regency season that I think is worth holding before we close the night. The institution, as we have seen, did not survive in its specific form. The court hoops are gone. The patronesses are gone. The Almack's voucher is a phrase in a history book. The presentation at court after long centuries ended in 1958 and is not coming back. The whole specific apparatus of what it meant to be a debutante in 1814 is, by 2026, an institution that exists only in the historical imagination. But what those women carried inside themselves, the thing the season actually produced in them, has not gone away. The capacity for self-possession in observed spaces, the capacity to hold one's own emotional weather privately while the public face does its work, the understanding that beauty, however constructed, is also a real thing in the world that gives pleasure to those who see it. The deep recognition of female friendship as a sustaining force across the lifetime, the acceptance that one's life is shaped, in part, by structures one did not design and cannot dismantle, while finding within those structures the actual lived freedom that the human spirit always finds in some form. The knowing in the bone that adulthood is something one enters and does not leave, and that the entering is best marked, somehow, with attention. These things are not Regency, they are human. The Regency season gave them a particular form for a particular generation. The form has changed. The substance underneath is still here. You, listening to me tonight, in your bed, in whatever room you happen to be in, are connected to that young woman in the carriage by something that goes beyond the historical curiosity of the connection. You are, in your way, also a person who has stood in observed rooms. You have walked into spaces in which you were being assessed. You have felt the small chill of the cold greeting and the warmth of the kind one. You have, perhaps, gone home from a long day or a long event and looked at yourself in a mirror and tried to understand what it had cost you and what it had given you. You have friends who are the friends of your shared experience, who know what you have been through because they have been through it beside you. You have mothers, or had them, who worked in ways you did not always see for outcomes, you did not always recognize as their gift to you. You have, in short, lived in some version a life that has its own rhythms of preparation and presentation and exhaustion and quiet recovery, different in form from hers, the same in many ways underneath. The young woman in the carriage, by the time the late afternoon has begun to turn into early evening, has crossed into the county of her childhood. She recognizes the road, she recognizes the villages, She passes the lane that leads to the house of the family her parents have known for 30 years. She passes the steeple of the church where she was baptized. She passes the inn where her father always changes the horses on the way home from London. The country she has known all her life is gathering around her again, and the city she has been living in for 4 months is by now several hours and many miles behind her. The carriage turns at last into the lane that leads to the family house. The horses know they are home and lift their pace slightly. The hedgerows on either side narrow, the lane bends. The old gates appear, and beyond them the long drive, and beyond the drive the house she has lived in since she was born. The light has begun to soften, the evening is coming. The servants who remained at home through the season have come out to the front of the house to welcome the family back, the housekeeper and the gardener, and the older butler who is too settled in his ways to be moved up to London any more. They stand on the gravel as the carriage pulls up. The coachman draws the horses to a halt. The footman gets down to open the door. She steps down out of the carriage. Her feet, in their travelling shoes, touch the gravel of the drive. The smell of the country, the cut hay in the meadow beyond the garden, the roses by the front porch, the cool stone of the house itself in the late summer afternoon comes up around her. She is home. The season is over. Whatever happened in London is now part of what she carries. Whatever happens next will start tomorrow or the next day, when the trunks have been unpacked and the household has settled and she has slept in her own bed for the first time in 4 months. The night she will eat a quiet supper with her family, and she will go upstairs, and she will lie down in the bed she has known since childhood, and she will almost immediately fall asleep. That is, I think, where I want to leave her. In the cool country bedroom of her old house, in the early hours of the August night, with the casement window open and the country air coming in, and her own deep tiredness finally permitted to express itself. The season is behind her. The future is waiting. In between the two, just for tonight, she has the simple gift of her own pillow, and her own quiet, and her own complete physical permission to rest. The young woman who rose at 11 for 4 months, and who came home at 4 for 4 months, who danced and curtsied and conversed and listened and watched, is finally allowed to be no one, alone, asleep, in the dark of her own house. That is, perhaps, the simplest and the most underrated of the gifts the country provided after the season ended. The gift of being, for a few hours at a time, no one at all. And that is, I think, also the gift you have, tonight, in your own bed, in your own quiet, with your own day finally allowed to rest behind you. Whatever you have been carrying through the day, whoever you have been to other people, whatever rooms you have stood in and assessed and been assessed in, you are, for the next few hours, no one at all. You are simply yourself, breathing, slowing, settling. The Regency debutante, who is now in her own bed 212 years ago, finally asleep, and you in your own bed in this present moment, finally about to sleep, are doing the same thing. You are letting the day end. You are letting the body rest. You are giving your mind permission to stop the work of being a self in public for a few hours, and to drift, instead, into the simpler work of being a body asleep. That is enough for one night. The seasons that we live through, in whatever form they take, are real, and they ask real things of us, and they give us, in return, real things. But none of them ask us to be awake all the time. The young woman in the country bedroom in 1814, the listener in the modern bedroom tonight, the readers who will come after us in 200 years and who will look back at our own social rituals with whatever mixture of curiosity and pity their own moment provides. All of us share the same simple need at the end of each day. The day must close, the room must darken, the body must be allowed to rest, the mind must be allowed to stop for a while and let the next morning come in its own time. So let your shoulders drop one more time, let your jaw unclench, let the muscles of your face go soft, let your hands, wherever they are, settle into the warmth of the bedclothes. The Regency debutante is asleep in her country bedroom. London is far away. The season is over for the year. The candles in the great drawing rooms of Mayfair have burned down and been carried out by the servants and replaced for tomorrow night. The carriages are at rest in their mews. The patronesses are asleep in their own beds, in their own great houses, dreaming whatever they dream. The young women who were dancing 3 nights ago at the Duchess's ball are tonight in their own country houses, in their own beds, and you are here, in your bed, in your own quiet present, in the long, slow continuity of human evenings that connects you to all of them, and to everyone before them, and to everyone who will come after. The day is done. The season, whatever your own current season looks like, will continue tomorrow. But for tonight, the work is finished. For tonight, the room is dark. For tonight, the breath is slow. There is one thing I want to say before we close tonight about the women whose names did not survive. Of the thousands of young women who came through the Regency season in its decades of operation, only a tiny number left any kind of historical record. The diaries that survive, the letters that have been published, the names that turn up in modern accounts of the era represent perhaps 1 in 1,000 of the actual debutantes. The rest came up to London, did their season, married or did not marry, lived their lives, and left no trace beyond a parish register, and perhaps a marriage settlement filed in a county archive that nobody has read for 150 years. These are, in many ways, the women I have been thinking about all evening. Not the famous heiresses, not the great society beauties, not the patronesses whose portraits hang in the National Portrait Gallery, not the future duchesses whose miniatures sit in glass cases in country house museums. The women in the middle of the season, in the second tier of families, whose names appear in the dance card of one ball and then disappear, who married a quiet country gentleman and went home to manage his estate, whose lives were uneventful by the standards of the historical record, but were, to the women themselves, the only lives they had. If you could go back, somehow, and stand at the side of the Almack's ballroom on a Wednesday night in May of 1814, you would see hundreds of these young women, the ones in white gowns, the ones with their dance cards in their gloved hands, the ones smiling because they had been told to smile, who were tired because the previous night had been long, who were hopeful because they were 18 and the world was open to them, who were anxious because the world's openness was conditional on choices that had not yet been made. Each of them had a story. Each of them was, in her own consciousness, the centre of her own evening, watching the room around her, registering who was watching her in return, calculating, smiling, doing her best. We have, in most cases, lost the story. What we have left is the institution, the form, the rooms in which they stood, the gowns they wore, the dances they danced. The women themselves have become, mostly, anonymous. They are the women in the background of every Regency painting. They are the chorus of every Regency novel. They are the foundation on which the few famous individual stories were laid. I find that I want to mark this somehow, not to make it sad, because in the main it was not a sad reality. It is simply how time works. We remember the few, we forget the many. The few we remember stand in for the many we do not. The Regency season was, for all its strangeness and its glamour, the lived reality of mostly anonymous people, doing their best with what they had, in the conditions they were given, and most of them are now beyond the reach of any history that we will ever write. That is the texture of almost all of human history when you really look at it. A small number of remembered figures and an enormous, almost infinite number of unremembered ones standing behind them in the candlelight of rooms that have long since been demolished, dancing dances that no living person now knows how to dance, in dresses that have crumbled into dust in trunks in attics, that have been cleared out by descendants who never knew their names. We carry, when we walk through any historical era, a debt to a vast number of people whose lives made the era what it was, and who are now beyond our capacity to thank. What I have tried to give you tonight is some sense of what it might have felt like to be one of those women, not at her most famous moment, not at her most tragic, just on a Wednesday night in May, going to Almack's with her mother, in a borrowed carriage, in a white gown, with a small printed dance card in her gloved hand, into a ballroom where her future was, in some sense, going to be decided, and where she would do her best, in the way that most of us do our best in most of the moments of our lives without quite knowing what the outcome would be, but trusting that it would somehow work out. The historical record, when you read it patiently, is full of these moments. The diaries that survive, the letters that were preserved, the offhand mentions in older relatives' memoirs of an aunt who came up in 1814 and married well or did not, suggest that the experience was, for most who lived it, manageable, hard in places, boring in places, frightening occasionally, magical occasionally. Mostly just the 4 months of life that came at the age of 18 for a particular class of English women in a particular era of English history, and that those women, almost universally, remembered for the rest of their lives. There is something quietly remarkable about that. The Regency season was, for the women who survived it, the most intensely lived 4 months of their early life. Many of them, in their later years, went back to it in memory more often than they went back to almost any other period. The dances they had danced at 20 stayed clear in their minds when their grandchildren had grown up around them. The first sight of a London ballroom from the top of the staircase was the kind of memory that did not fade with age. They had been present in those rooms in a way they were perhaps never quite present again. Whatever else we say about the institution that put them through this, whatever its faults and its strangenesses and its inequities, it produced this, a generation of women whose youth had been intensely felt, whose memories by the time they were old were rich with detail that does not come easily in lives lived at a quieter pace. Most of us, looking back at any age, would settle for that. I want to ask you something before I let you go, because I think it sits at the heart of why this story matters at all. What does it mean to be on display? To live, for a stretch of months or years, with the awareness that you are being watched, that your appearance and your conversation and your conduct are being assessed, that the assessments will have consequences you cannot fully control. The Regency debutante had this experience in a particularly acute form because the structure of her world made it explicit. The audience was named, the judges were known by name, The assessments were spoken aloud at morning calls and written down in letters that travelled by the same post that carried her own correspondence. There was nothing hidden about the watching. Most of us today do not live like that, or at least we do not think we do. The patronesses are gone, the morning calls are gone, the dance cards are gone. We like to tell ourselves, a private life that the women of 1814 would not have recognized. We can be, in a way they could not. But sit with the question for a moment. Are we really so unobserved? The young person of 2026, walking into a room with her telephone in her hand, has in her pocket the means by which her appearance will, within hours, be transmitted to a circle of watchers larger than any patroness of Olmac's commanded. The photograph she takes of herself in front of the mirror before going out will be seen by dozens, by hundreds, perhaps by thousands. The judgments will be rendered, not in the careful coded language of morning calls, but in the immediate quantified language of likes and comments and shares. The assessment will be returned to her almost in real time. She will know, within an hour of arriving at the party, whether her presentation has been received well or poorly. She will adjust accordingly the next time. She will, over the years, develop the same kind of careful self-management that the Regency debutante had to develop, watching her own image in the mirror with the practiced eye of someone who knows it is going to be seen. I am not saying that the modern young woman is in the same situation as the Regency debutante. The stakes are different. The consequences are different. The freedom to opt out is, in most cases, real for her in a way it was not real for her great-great-great-grandmother. But the underlying experience of being watched, of being assessed, of being on display in front of an audience whose verdict has consequences, has not gone away. It has migrated. It has spread. It has, in some respects, what I would say to the young woman of 2026 who finds the Regency season fascinating and who watches the dramas about it on her television and reads the novels about it on her phone, is this: the women you are watching are not so far from you. They were doing, in their elaborate gowns and their careful curtsies, what you are doing today in your own particular costume, with your own particular tools. They were preparing themselves for an appearance in front of an audience whose judgment mattered. They were managing the slight tremor of nerves before they walked into the room. They were practicing the smile they would offer when they were greeted. They were learning, by trial and error, what worked and what did not. They were 18. They were excited. They were tired. They were hopeful. They were doing their best. The forms have changed completely. The experience has not. So when you watch a debutante curtsy to the Queen in some television adaptation, or read a novel in which a young woman walks into Olmac's for the first time, or look at a portrait of a Regency lady in white muslin, with her plumes in her hair, do not think of her as belonging entirely to the past. She is, in some sense, you. Her concerns are recognizable. Her hopes are familiar. The shape of her evening is not so different from the shape of yours, however different the surface might be. We are, all of us, in some version of the room she stood in, at some point in our lives. The only question is what we do with the experience. There is one more image I want to leave you with, and then I will let you go. It is past 3 in the morning in London, in May of 1814. You are 18 years old. You are climbing into the family carriage in front of the great house where the ball has just ended. Your mother is beside you, half asleep already, her bonnet slightly askew, her gloves crumpled in her lap. Your slippers are damaged beyond repair. Your gown has a small claret stain on the hem from a glass that someone bumped at supper. Your dance card, in your reticule, has every line filled. Your hair is coming down. Your gloves are beginning to fray. You have danced with 8 different gentlemen. You have spoken to a dozen others. You have eaten almost nothing. You have laughed more than you can remember laughing in any single evening of your life so far. The carriage rolls off into the quiet pre-dawn streets of Mayfair, the horses' hooves echoing on the cobbles, the light of a few remaining candles flickering in the windows of the houses still occupied. The streets are empty. The world has gone to bed without you. The whole city is quiet for once. You can hear, faintly, the call of a watchman in the distance. You can smell the dampness of the early morning air through the window of the carriage. The horses move at their slow walk, in no hurry, the coachman knowing that you are tired, that there is no need now to be anywhere quickly. Somewhere in your bones you know that this night will stay, that you will remember it when you are an old woman in a country house, telling your granddaughter about the spring of 1814, that this is one of those nights that the rest of life is going to be measured against. You do not know it yet, but you are right. And as the carriage turns the corner into your street, and the footman jumps down from the back to ring the bell, and the front door opens for you with the housekeeper standing in the hall in her dressing gown to take your shawl, and the night air gives way to the warmth of the house, and the familiar smell of the candles in your own staircase rises around you, you are, for one quiet second, exactly where you were always going to be, 18 years old, in London, in May of 1814, on the threshold of everything that will come next. That is the picture I want to leave with you tonight. The carriage in the empty street, the young woman in the white gown, the night just ended, the morning not yet begun, and around her, in the houses she passes, hundreds of other young women in similar carriages on similar streets, going home from similar evenings, all of them in some sense alone, all of them in some sense together, all of them at the centre of their own lives in a way that was, however briefly, exactly what their lives had been preparing them for. 200 years from now, somebody else may look back at us in something like the way we have looked back at them tonight. They will find our customs strange. They will find our tools quaint. They will smile, perhaps, at the elaborateness of the rituals by which we organized our own coming of age. They will, with luck, also find us recognizable, familiar, sympathetic, just people, doing their best, in the conditions they were given, hoping for the lives they wanted, often without quite knowing what those lives would turn out to be. That is, I think, the gift that history gives us when we approach it gently. It connects us to the people who came before. It reminds us that we are part of a much longer story than the one our own short lives can hold. It teaches us, when we let it, a kind of compassion for ourselves by way of compassion for them. They were, in the end, like us, which is to say, we are, in the end, like them. That, as much as the gowns and the candlelight and the carriages, is what the Regency season can give us. 2 centuries after the last of its debutantes climbed the stairs of Almack's for the first time, I hope tonight's story stayed with you. I hope you carry the picture of the carriage in the empty street into your sleep. I hope, when you find yourself walking into a room tomorrow, or next week, or next month, where you feel yourself being watched, you can think for a moment about the women in white muslin who walked into similar rooms 200 years ago with similar hopes and similar fears, and you can feel, for one quiet second, the company of the long line of people who have been where you are now. Sleep well, stay warm, Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one.